The story of the Battle of Moscow cannot be told without tracing back to the moment when Hitler made his fateful decision to turn east, to gamble the fate of his empire on a campaign that would become one of the greatest military struggles in history. The road to Barbarossa was paved with ideology, ambition, fear, and arrogance. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Germany under Adolf Hitler had become the most dominant power on the European continent. The lightning campaigns in Poland, the breathtaking victories in Norway, the Low Countries, and France had given the Wehrmacht an aura of invincibility. The Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable, and German generals appeared to have unlocked a formula for swift, crushing success. By the summer of 1940, with France defeated and Britain standing alone, Hitler's gaze turned eastward. His obsession with Lebensraum, the quest for living space in the East, was not new. It had been a cornerstone of his ideology from the very beginning, laid out in Mein Kampf and reiterated in countless speeches. The Soviet Union represented both an opportunity and an existential threat to Hitler. Conquering the vast territories of Russia, Ukraine, and beyond would secure resources, agricultural wealth, and space for a German-dominated empire. At the same time, it would destroy the Bolshevik state, which he considered the ideological enemy of Nazism. The conquest of the East was not a mere military objective, it was an ideological crusade. Hitler's war was not only against states but against systems, and in the Soviet Union he saw a combination of Slavic inferiority and communist leadership that he believed must be eradicated. The months following the fall of France became a period of preparation, hesitation, and delusion. Britain, though battered, refused to yield. The Luftwaffe had failed to break the island nation during the Battle of Britain. The prospect of invading across the Channel grew dimmer by the day. Hitler, increasingly impatient with a stalemated conflict, believed that Britain was clinging to the hope of Soviet or American intervention. To him, the solution was clear: crush the Soviet Union, eliminate any possibility of an Eastern counterweight, and force Britain into submission. The decision was not universally popular among his generals. Some argued for consolidating gains in the West, securing the Mediterranean, or focusing on strangling Britain through air and naval power. Yet Hitler's will was absolute. In December 1940, he signed Directive No. 21, the order for Operation Barbarossa. It set the wheels in motion for the greatest invasion the world had ever seen. The planning of Barbarossa revealed both the brilliance and the blindness of German strategy. The initial concept envisioned a rapid campaign lasting only a few months. The Wehrmacht would launch a massive three-pronged assault: Army Group North, striking toward Leningrad; Army Group South, advancing into Ukraine; and the most powerful formation, Army Group Center, driving straight toward Moscow. The assumption was that the Red Army would collapse within weeks, just as the French had. The Soviet state, thought to be brittle and incompetent, would shatter under the weight of blitzkrieg. Hitler and his generals believed that the campaign could be won before the onset of the Russian winter, a lesson burned into memory by Napoleon's disaster more than a century earlier. Confidence brimmed within the ranks. German soldiers, hardened by victories in Western Europe, looked east with anticipation. Many believed that the campaign would be short and glorious, another triumph in the march of the Reich across Europe. But beneath the surface, cracks already existed in the grand design. Intelligence reports underestimated Soviet strength. German planners assumed that the Red Army numbered around 200 divisions, poorly equipped and badly led. In reality, the Soviets had far more, and though the purges of Stalin in the late 1930s had decapitated much of the military leadership, the capacity for regeneration was immense. Soviet industry, though not fully mobilized, had the potential to dwarf that of Germany once it was set in motion. Yet such realities were dismissed or ignored, buried beneath the arrogance of past victories and the ideological conviction that the Slavs could not stand against the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, Stalin and the Soviet leadership were not blind to the rising threat. Reports of German troop buildups along the frontier, trickled in throughout the winter and spring of 1941. Yet Stalin, suspicious of both German deception and British attempts to lure him into conflict, chose denial over confrontation. He believed Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain still resisted. The Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, though born of convenience, gave Stalin hope that the storm could be delayed. The Red Army, still reeling from the purges and poor performance in the Winter War against Finland, was in the midst of reorganization. Stalin's instinct was to avoid provocation, to buy time. Orders were given not to respond to German provocations along the border. Defensive preparations lagged. When the invasion finally came, it caught the Soviet Union off balance, not because the threat was unseen, but because Stalin refused to believe it would materialize so soon. For the German High Command, the preparations were colossal. Over 3 million soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of vehicles, horses, and artillery pieces, were assembled along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was a logistical nightmare, but also a staggering demonstration of German organizational capacity. Supplies were stockpiled, railways converted to German gauge, and vast amounts of fuel and ammunition prepared for the opening blow. The Luftwaffe readied thousands of aircraft to sweep the skies clear of Soviet resistance. Panzer divisions, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were primed to tenacing separations, spearhead deep penetrations, encircling Soviet armies in massive pockets. The sheer scale of Barbarossa dwarfed any campaign that had come before. Yet even as preparations reached their peak, warning signs flashed. The German economy, strained by years of war, could not easily sustain such an operation. Oil supplies were limited, and the reliance on horses for transport revealed the gap between modern mechanized ideals and practical reality. The assumption that the campaign would be short was not merely optimism, it was necessity. Germany could not sustain a long war of attrition against the Soviet Union. Victory had to be swift. Hitler himself framed the invasion in existential terms. He spoke not only of conquest but of annihilation. Barbarossa was to be a war of extermination. Commissars, Jews, and other groups targeted by Nazi ideology were marked for death. The Einsatzgruppen followed the armies, tasked with mass killings that foreshadowed the broader horrors of the Holocaust. This was not a conventional war. It was an ideological crusade that fused military ambition with genocidal intent. On the eve of the invasion, soldiers along the frontier prepared for what they believed would be the decisive blow against Bolshevism. Propaganda painted the campaign as a holy war for civilization. Officers briefed their men on the weakness of the enemy, promising swift victories. Few could imagine the scale of the struggle that lay ahead, or the suffering that would engulf millions. The Soviet frontier was quiet on the night of the 21st of June 1941. Villagers slept unaware that the largest invasion force in history was poised to strike. In Moscow, Stalin continued to dismiss warnings, convinced that the Germans would not risk open war. In Berlin, Hitler waited with grim satisfaction, certain that destiny was about to unfold. When dawn broke on June 22, the world changed. The thunder of artillery, the roar of tanks, and the drone of aircraft shattered the morning calm. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The Wehrmacht surged forward with breathtaking speed, smashing through Soviet positions, encircling armies, and driving deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. The early days seemed to confirm German confidence. Soviet divisions crumbled, commanders were paralyzed, and the Luftwaffe claimed dominance of the skies. Villages and towns fell one after another. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured in vast pockets, their fates sealed by the merciless advance. It seemed, at least in those first weeks, that Hitler's gamble might succeed. Yet even in those opening days the seeds of disaster were sown. The distances were immense, the resistance more stubborn than anticipated, and the brutality of the German occupation ensured that the Soviet people would fight with a ferocity born of survival. Moscow, the great prize at the heart of the campaign, loomed in the distance, but the road to it would prove longer and harder than anyone in Berlin imagined. The journey to the gates of the Soviet capital would test the Wehrmacht not only against an enemy but against time, nature, and the very limits of human endurance. The road to Barbarossa was therefore more than the story of an invasion. It was the collision of two visions of the world: Hitler's dream of conquest and annihilation against Stalin's grim determination to hold the heart of his empire. It was the opening act in a drama that would engulf millions, reshape the course of history, and turn Moscow into the stage for one of the most decisive battles mankind has ever seen. The dawn of the 22nd of June 1941 unleashed a storm across the eastern horizon that few could have truly anticipated. In the hours before sunrise, German artillery roared to life, pounding Soviet frontier positions along a front that stretched nearly 2,000 kilometers. The rumble of shells and the flash of fire heralded the beginning of the largest land invasion in recorded history. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's great gamble, was underway. For the men of the Wehrmacht, it was the moment they had been trained for, drilled for, and promised would bring about the decisive destruction of Bolshevism. For the Red Army soldiers caught in their barracks or dugouts, it was a nightmare that materialized in an instant. The thunder of the invasion shattered the fragile peace of summer, and within hours, whole Soviet formations were being consumed by fire and steel. The early days of Barbarossa seemed to validate every boast of German supremacy. Army Group North surged through the Baltic states, bypassing weak Soviet defenses and racing toward Leningrad. Army Group South plunged into Ukraine, targeting the fertile farmlands and industrial centers that Hitler craved. Yet the most dramatic advances came from Army Group Center, the largest and most powerful formation of the invasion, tasked with the drive through Belarus and toward Moscow itself. Spearheaded by armored divisions under the command of men like Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, supported by the relentless air cover of the Luftwaffe, the panzers cut swathes through Soviet defenses. Villages burned, convoys were annihilated, and bewildered Soviet troops were swept aside as the German tide poured eastward. The element of surprise was devastating. Despite numerous intelligence warnings, Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would break the 1939 non-aggression pact at that moment. Soviet troops along the border were ill-prepared. Their planes parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields that were obliterated in the opening Luftwaffe raids. Within hours, hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground, granting the Germans near total dominance of the skies. The Red Army's command structure, already weakened by Stalin's purges of the late 1932nd that had decimated its officer corps, collapsed under the shock. Communications broke down, orders were delayed or contradictory, and whole units found themselves cut off without direction. Against this backdrop of confusion, the Wehrmacht advanced with an efficiency that seemed unstoppable. To the outside world, it was a stunning display of power. Radio broadcasts announced victory after victory. German propaganda trumpeted the collapse of Soviet armies, the encirclement of entire divisions, and the capture of thousands upon thousands of prisoners. Photographs of endless columns of Red Army soldiers being marched into captivity reinforced the sense that Hitler's war in the East was destined to end quickly. By July, vast pockets of Soviet troops had been trapped and destroyed in encirclements at Bialystok, Minsk, and Smolensk. In a matter of weeks, the Germans claimed to have captured or killed over 1 million enemy soldiers. Cities fell one after another, and the Wehrmacht's armored spearheads pressed relentlessly forward, covering distances that seemed inconceivable in so short a time. On the ground, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht felt the intoxication of triumph. Many believed they were part of a campaign that would eclipse all others in history. Letters sent home brimmed with confidence. They described the vastness of the landscape, the burning villages, the broken Soviet tanks scattered across fields, and the long lines of prisoners trudging westward. German units often advanced so quickly that their supply columns struggled to keep up, yet the momentum itself seemed unstoppable. Panzer commanders, exhilarated by their successes, pushed ever deeper into Soviet territory, slicing through defenses and encircling new formations before they could regroup. For these men, it was a campaign unlike any they had seen in France or Poland. The enemy was vast, the land immense, but the victories were undeniable. The Soviet response in those early weeks was chaotic and desperate. Ill-equipped divisions were thrown piecemeal into battle, often without adequate training or coordination. Soviet tanks, many of them obsolete models, were no match for the well-drilled German armored crews, who exploited superior tactics and communications. The Luftwaffe strafed retreating columns with impunity, while artillery smashed defensive lines before infantry even arrived. Red Army soldiers fought bravely in many places, but their resistance seemed futile in the face of German coordination and firepower. Entire units disintegrated, their commanders killed or captured, their soldiers left to fend for themselves. The Germans called these early battles Kesselschlachten, cauldron battles, where Soviet armies were encircled, trapped, and annihilated. The term became synonymous with German operational mastery, a brutal dance of encirclement and destruction. The scale of Soviet losses in those early weeks defies comprehension. In the first month alone, the Red Army lost over 10,000 tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and more than 1 million men killed, wounded, or captured. It was a catastrophe that might have broken any other nation. German soldiers marveled at the apparent endlessness of the Soviet manpower, yet the destruction seemed so total that few believed the Soviets could possibly recover. German officers reported scenes of chaos, with Soviet troops surrendering en masse or fleeing into the forests, abandoning equipment and weapons in the face of relentless pressure. The Luftwaffe reported daily kill tallies of hundreds of aircraft, reducing the once massive Soviet Air Force to a shadow of itself. To many observers, it seemed that Hitler's gamble had been justified, that the Soviet Union was indeed a giant with feet of clay. Yet beneath the triumph, subtle signs of strain emerged. The vast distances of the Soviet Union began to stretch German logistics. Supply lines lengthened. Railroads had to be converted from the Soviet broad gauge to the narrower German standard, and fuel shortages began to appear. The speed of the advance created a paradox. The further the Wehrmacht pushed, the more difficult it became to sustain the momentum. Horses still pulled a large portion of German supplies, and in the mud and dust of the Russian summer, animals collapsed from exhaustion. Trucks broke down on rutted roads, and bridges destroyed by retreating Soviets had to be rebuilt under constant pressure. While the victories on the battlefield were undeniable, the machinery that sustained them was beginning to strain under the weight of distance. For the Soviet people, the invasion was an apocalypse. Villages burned, cities fell, and millions were displaced. Yet even in those dark days, seeds of resistance took root. Civilians fled eastward, joining the great evacuations of industry that would, in time, save the Soviet war effort. Factories were dismantled and shipped beyond the Urals, where they would continue producing weapons far from German reach. Partisan bands began to form in the forests, harassing German supply lines and sowing chaos in the rear. Though small and uncoordinated at first, these efforts would grow into a formidable campaign of guerrilla warfare. For now, though, the Wehrmacht swept forward, seemingly unchecked, while the Soviet Union reeled from blow after devastating blow. In the cities and towns that fell to the Germans, the occupation began with cruelty. The Einsatzgruppen, following behind the army, began their grim work of mass shootings, targeting Jews, communists, and other groups marked for extermination. The war in the East was not just a military campaign, it was a war of annihilation, a collision of ideologies that turned every village into a potential site of atrocity. For German soldiers, the brutality was both shocking and normalized. Some recoiled at the horrors, others participated willingly, and many more looked away, consumed by the demands of the front. The triumphs of the Wehrmacht were thus intertwined with a campaign of terror that foreshadowed even greater horrors to come. By midsummer, the German High Command looked at the maps with a sense of awe. The front lines had moved hundreds of kilometers eastward. Army Group North pressed toward Leningrad, threatening to encircle the great city. Army Group South was advancing deep into Ukraine, targeting Kiev and the resource-rich Donbass. But it was Army Group Center, driving relentlessly toward Moscow, that seemed poised for the decisive blow. The battles of encirclement had devastated Soviet forces in Belarus, and the road to the Soviet capital seemed to lie open. German generals argued over the next steps. Should they press immediately for Moscow, the symbolic and strategic heart of the Soviet Union, or should they secure the flanks, turning south to destroy Soviet forces in Ukraine? Hitler vacillated, torn between the lure of Moscow and the promise of Ukraine's resources. These debates would prove fateful, shaping the course of the campaign in ways that no one could fully foresee. For the moment, though, triumph reigned. German soldiers believed they were writing history. They advanced through endless fields, across rivers and forests, under skies patrolled by the ever-present Luftwaffe. Every day brought new victories, new captures, new prisoners. The Red Army seemed broken, its soldiers scattered and demoralized, its commanders incapable of mounting a coherent defense. The confidence of the Wehrmacht was absolute. They had conquered France in 6 weeks. They had crushed Poland in a matter of days. Surely, they believed, the Soviet Union would collapse before the snows of winter fell. And yet, even as the Wehrmacht basked in its triumphs, a different reality was taking shape beneath the surface. The Red Army was battered, but not destroyed. New divisions were being raised, hastily trained, and thrown into the path of the German advance. Factories were being reassembled in the east, already beginning to churn out tanks and guns. Stalin, shaken but not broken, began to rally his people with speeches that invoked both fear and patriotism. The Soviet Union, vast and resilient, was absorbing the blow and preparing to endure. The Germans could not yet see it, but the seeds of their failure were already germinating. The early triumphs of the Wehrmacht in the summer of 1941 were among the most dazzling in military history. They revealed the power of blitzkrieg, the effectiveness of German operational art, and the ferocity of an army at the height of its confidence. But they also concealed the fragility of that success. Distance, logistics, climate, and the sheer resilience of the Soviet people would, in time, erode the triumphs and turn them into ashes. For now, though, as the panzers roared eastward and Soviet armies crumbled, it seemed that the fate of Moscow, and perhaps the war itself, hung in the balance. The world watched in awe and fear as the Wehrmacht pressed ever closer to its greatest prize, unaware that the very triumphs of those early months were carrying within them the seeds of disaster. The thunderclap of the 22nd of June 1941 did more than open the gates of war. It ripped apart the illusions upon which Stalin had staked his cautious faith. The Soviet Union, vast and defiant in propaganda, found itself suddenly naked before an enemy that struck with speed and precision never before seen. For the Red Army, still reeling from the purges of the late 1932 that had decimated its leadership, the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa were nothing less than a catastrophe. Commanders were absent, chains of command fractured, and soldiers on the frontier awoke to the deafening roar of artillery that heralded the collapse of their world. In the opening days, Soviet defenses simply imploded. Border garrisons, poorly supplied and often under orders not to provoke the Germans, were caught completely off guard. Airfields burned under the sudden strikes of the Luftwaffe, their aircraft destroyed before they could even take off. In the chaos, some pilots scrambled desperately into the skies, only to be swarmed by experienced German fighters who cut them down with brutal efficiency. The Soviet Air Force, one of the largest in the world on paper, was reduced to ruins in days. Without air cover, Soviet troops on the ground faced German bombers and fighters that prowled overhead at will, turning roads into death traps and convoys into twisted wreckage. On the ground, Soviet units attempted to resist, but they were hampered by disorganization and inadequate preparation. Communications broke down as German artillery destroyed command posts and severed telephone lines. Orders issued from Moscow often arrived too late or contradicted one another, leaving local commanders paralyzed. The purges of 1937 had hollowed out the officer corps, leaving inexperienced men in positions of command. Many were too afraid of Stalin's wrath to retreat or improvise without explicit orders. The result was paralysis at the very moment when flexibility was most needed. German armored columns exploited this mercilessly, driving deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies, and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners in a matter of weeks. For the ordinary Soviet soldier, the shock was overwhelming. Men drafted only months before found themselves in battles that were already lost before they began. Units were cut off and surrounded, their commanders killed or fled. Some soldiers fought to the last bullet, others surrendered, and many simply fled into the forests. The sheer scale of the disaster defies comprehension. In the first weeks, entire armies disappeared from the maps, swallowed by German encirclements at Minsk and Smolensk. Reports of these calamities trickled back to Moscow, painting a picture so grim that Stalin himself reportedly refused to believe them at first. When reality became undeniable, his fury was unleashed, and orders against retreat were issued with terrifying clarity. Not one step back, fight where you stand, or face execution for cowardice. The chaos was not confined to the military. Civilians, too, were caught in the maelstrom. As German armies advanced, millions were displaced, fleeing eastward in columns that clogged roads already choked with retreating soldiers and broken equipment. Mothers carried infants wrapped in blankets, children trudged through the dust, old men pulled carts laden with what little they could save. Trains leaving western cities were jammed to suffocation with evacuees, livestock, and crates of machinery, as factories were dismantled and shipped eastward to the Urals. This evacuation, though chaotic, would prove decisive in the long run. Entire industries were relocated beyond the reach of German bombers, preserving the Soviet Union's capacity to fight. But in the summer of 1941, it looked like desperation. The Wehrmacht advanced relentlessly. Their armored spearheads cut through Soviet defenses with ruthless efficiency, and their infantry followed in grim determination, occupying village after village. German soldiers marveled at the endless streams of prisoners marching westward under guard. In some sectors, Soviet troops surrendered en masse, convinced that resistance was futile. Others fought bitterly, particularly where political commissars enforced discipline at gunpoint, but even these stands often ended in encirclement and annihilation. The German practice of Kesselschlacht cauldron battles devoured entire Soviet formations. At Minsk, more than 300,000 Soviet troops were surrounded and captured. At Smolensk, another 200,000 were lost. Each encirclement was a hammer blow that seemed to hollow out the Red Army itself. And yet, beneath the surface of disaster, there flickered a stubborn will to endure. In countless towns and villages, ordinary soldiers and civilians fought back in whatever way they could. Machine gun nests held out in burning ruins until their last rounds were spent. Farmers took up rifles abandoned by retreating soldiers. Women dug anti-tank ditches, filled sandbags, and helped fortify cities. Soviet propaganda had long prepared the population with images of patriotic defense. But now that rhetoric was tested in fire. Some of the most desperate fighting occurred around Leningrad and Kiev, where Soviet defenders clung to their positions despite overwhelming odds. Though these battles often ended in retreat or defeat, they bled the Germans and bought precious time. The atmosphere in Moscow was one of shock and fear. As news of defeat spread, panic threatened to take hold. Rumors swirled of German tanks only days away, of traitors within the city, of spies and saboteurs waiting to strike. Stalin, initially paralyzed by the scale of the invasion, withdrew into silence for days, leaving his subordinates uncertain. But when he re-emerged, he projected the iron determination that would become his hallmark throughout the war. His speeches framed the conflict as the Great Patriotic War, a struggle for survival against fascist annihilation. He invoked the memory of Napoleon's failed invasion, reminding his people that Russia had endured such storms before and would endure again. This appeal to history and patriotism struck a chord with millions, stiffening resolve at the very moment when collapse seemed imminent. Still, the Red Army bled. By August, losses were staggering. Millions of men killed, wounded, or captured. Tens of thousands of tanks and guns destroyed, and whole regions of the Soviet Union occupied. German generals believed victory was near. The Soviets appeared incapable of mounting a coherent defense, and the road to Moscow seemed open. Yet the very vastness of the Soviet Union, combined with its capacity to absorb punishment, began to tell. Unlike Poland or France, the Soviet Union could retreat hundreds of kilometers and still fight. Its armies, though mauled, reformed again and again, fed by an inexhaustible reservoir of manpower. Reinforcements poured in from Siberia, Central Asia, and the Far East. New divisions were raised almost overnight, filled with barely trained recruits, but they fought with desperation. Each week, new units appeared to replace those destroyed, a grim reminder to the Germans that this was no ordinary enemy. For the soldiers on the ground, the shock of Barbarossa was more than just military defeat, it was psychological devastation. Soviet troops were confronted not only with the overwhelming power of the German army, but also with the brutal reality of what the war meant. The Einsatzgruppen followed the Wehrmacht, carrying out mass shootings of Jews, communists, and intellectuals. Villages were burned, hostages executed, and terror spread wherever German control took hold. Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans faced starvation in vast prison camps, where hundreds of thousands would die within months. The war in the East was revealed to be one of annihilation, not merely conquest. For Soviet soldiers, surrender no longer offered safety. This realization hardened resistance, transforming shock into grim resolve. The Soviet High Command struggled to regain control. Stalin appointed new generals, many of them untested but ruthless, and demanded discipline at any cost. Harsh measures were enacted. Desertion was punished by execution. Retreat without orders could mean death, and political commissars were embedded in every unit to enforce loyalty. Fear became a weapon of command, binding soldiers to their duty, even in the face of impossible odds. Slowly, amid the wreckage of defeat, the Red Army began to adapt. Commanders learned to avoid encirclement, to trade space for time, to exploit the depth of the Soviet Union's geography. Defensive lines were thrown up along rivers, forests, and cities, slowing the German advance. The pace of the blitzkrieg began to falter, not because of any single battle, but because resistance, however fragile, never ceased. The shock of Barbarossa seared itself into the Soviet psyche. It was a baptism of fire that revealed the cost of unpreparedness, the brutality of the enemy, and the scale of the struggle ahead. Millions perished in those first months, yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. Instead, it endured, adapting under pressure, mobilizing every resource, and transforming shock into determination. For the Red Army, the early defeats were both a humiliation and a lesson, one paid for in blood and suffering. And as the Wehrmacht pressed ever closer to Moscow, the stage was set for the greatest test of all. The Red Army's shock in the summer of 1941 was thus not the end of the story, but the beginning. Out of the chaos would come resilience, out of disaster would come adaptation, and out of fear would come defiance. The Germans believed the Soviets were finished. They were wrong. The shock was real, the losses catastrophic, but the Soviet Union still stood. And as the autumn approached, with the Wehrmacht closing in on Moscow, the battered Red Army prepared to fight again not as a broken force, but as a people galvanized by the realization that their very existence was at stake. The German war machine rolled eastward in the summer of 1941, with a confidence bordering on arrogance, convinced that the vast Soviet Union would crumble under the weight of blitzkrieg, just as Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France had fallen in rapid succession. The speed and ferocity of the opening blows confirmed that illusion. In Belarus, armored spearheads tore through Soviet lines, cutting deep into enemy territory with a velocity that seemed unstoppable. Villages vanished in flames, towns fell one after another, and columns of dazed Soviet prisoners marched westward under the guns of their captors. To the Germans, it appeared as though history itself was collapsing in their favor. They were enacting not just a military operation, but the fulfillment of Hitler's ideological prophecy, the destruction of Bolshevism and the conquest of Lebensraum in the east. The terrain of Belarus, with its endless forests, rivers, and marshlands, presented natural obstacles, but the Wehrmacht adapted with ruthless efficiency. Tanks thundered down narrow dirt roads, their treads crushing fields of rye and barley, while infantry columns wound their way through villages, requisitioning food and livestock. Luftwaffe squadrons prowled the skies overhead, hunting Soviet columns retreating eastward, turning highways into graveyards of smoldering trucks, overturned wagons, and twisted bicycles. For the local population, the invasion came like a storm. Families fled with what little they could carry. Others cowered in cellars as artillery shells tore through their homes. Entire communities vanished overnight, swallowed by the relentless tide of war. At Minsk, the Wehrmacht demonstrated the full efficiency of encirclement warfare. Within a week, German panzers had enveloped entire Soviet armies, closing a colossal pocket that trapped over 300,000 soldiers. The chaos inside was unimaginable. Soviet units cut off from supplies and communications fought desperately to break free, charging across fields under strafing fire, hiding in forests by day and moving by night. Many were hunted down, captured, or killed. Those who survived the encirclement staggered eastward, hungry, ragged, and haunted by the memory of their comrades left behind. German soldiers looked on with grim satisfaction as columns of Soviet prisoners, tens of thousands at a time, trudged westward. To the Germans, this was evidence of total collapse. To the Soviets, it was a living nightmare, the scale of which had never before been seen in modern war. Yet, even amid catastrophe, resistance simmered. Soviet soldiers who escaped encirclement often refused to return home, instead vanishing into forests to join or form partisan bands. These irregular fighters struck at German supply convoys, burned fuel depots, and assassinated collaborators. At first, their efforts were scattered and uncoordinated, but they would grow into a force that gnawed at the German rear, turning every village and every forest into a potential ambush. For the Wehrmacht, this was an early taste of the invisible enemy that would plague them throughout their time in the Soviet Union. As the Germans pressed toward the Dnieper, their momentum seemed irresistible. Panzer divisions pushed forward, leaving infantry to mop up resistance. Soviet defenders, stunned by the speed of the advance, tried to form new lines along rivers and towns, but these were quickly bypassed or broken. In many cases, Soviet units found themselves under orders to hold ground at all costs, a command that often led to annihilation. Stalin's paranoia, intensified by the fear of traitors and defeatists, meant that retreat without explicit authorization could mean execution. Commissars shadowed every unit, ensuring that fear of Moscow was as great as fear of the enemy. Soldiers were caught between two merciless forces, the Germans ahead and Stalin's wrath behind. The brutality of the invasion deepened with each passing week. The Einsatzgruppen followed close behind the advancing Wehrmacht, tasked not with fighting the Red Army, but with exterminating Jews, communists, and other undesirables. Entire communities were rounded up and shot in fields or forests. In towns across Belarus and Ukraine, Jews were forced into ghettos before being systematically massacred. Villagers suspected of aiding partisans were executed, homes burned, crops destroyed. The German War of Annihilation was not an accidental byproduct of combat. It was policy, deliberate and calculated. For the Soviet people, it meant that resistance was not merely patriotic, but existential. To surrender was often to die. To fight, however desperate, was the only path to survival. By late July, German forces were pressing towards Smolensk, the next great obstacle on the road to Moscow. Here, the Soviets stiffened their resistance. New armies were Smolensk, thrown into the fight, many composed of hastily trained recruits, but their sheer determination slowed the German advance. The Battle of Smolensk raged for weeks, with forests and fields turning into killing grounds. Soviet troops, though often poorly equipped, fought from every trench, village, and hillside, exacting a toll in German blood. For the first time since the invasion began, the Wehrmacht encountered sustained resistance that could not be brushed aside in a matter of days. The Smolensk battle revealed both the strength and fragility of the Soviet defense. On the one hand, entire Soviet armies were once again encircled and destroyed, another 200,000 men lost. On the other, the battle delayed the Germans for weeks, long enough to allow the Soviets to fortify positions further east and prepare for the defense of Moscow. For the German High Command, the delays were frustrating. Operation Barbarossa had been predicated on speed. Every day lost was a day closer to the onset of the Russian autumn rains and, beyond that, the dreaded winter. German generals debated their next move should they push directly toward Moscow or divert forces south to seize Ukraine and its resources. Hitler's indecision, coupled with his obsession with symbolic and economic targets, fractured the momentum of the campaign. While German forces debated, Soviet industry was on the move. In a staggering logistical feat, factories were dismantled and shipped eastward, beyond the Urals, to continue producing tanks, planes, and guns. Entire cities became staging grounds for this evacuation. Women and teenagers loaded machinery onto trains, worked double shifts, and replaced men sent to the front. Stalin's ruthless system, which had terrorized the Soviet people for years, now extracted from them an extraordinary level of sacrifice and labor. The Red Army, battered though it was, would not be left without weapons. The state's capacity to endure, to absorb punishment, and keep fighting, astonished even those within its ranks. The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, pushed deeper into the Soviet heartland. By late summer, German soldiers were thousands of kilometers from home, supplied by long, tenuous lines of trucks, horses, and railways. Their uniforms and equipment were still suited for a European summer, not the extremes of the Russian climate. Vehicles broke down, horses collapsed, and fuel shortages became increasingly severe. Yet the push continued, driven by the conviction that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. German soldiers marveled at the sheer scale of the land. They crossed endless forests, rivers that stretched to the horizon, villages that seemed primitive compared to European towns. Many began to wonder, could this vast land truly be conquered? The psychological strain began to tell on both sides. German soldiers, though victorious, were exhausted by constant marching and fighting, their hopes for a quick campaign fading with every kilometer. Soviet soldiers, though bloodied and demoralized, found strength in the very act of survival. Each day the Red Army continued to fight was a day closer to winter, a day closer to reinforcements, a day closer to turning the tide. Propaganda framed the struggle as a holy war for the motherland, and slowly the population began to believe it. Stalin's terror had ensured obedience, but it was the German brutality, the executions, the mass killings that transformed fear into defiance. By September, the German High Command stood at a crossroads. Moscow was within reach, but so too were the rich lands of Ukraine. Hitler, driven by ideology and obsession, ordered a diversion of forces southward to encircle Kiev. The decision delayed the drive on Moscow by critical weeks. The encirclement at Kiev was another devastating blow for the Soviets. With more than 600,000 troops captured, the largest single encirclement in history, yet the delay was priceless. It bought Moscow time to dig trenches, build fortifications, and prepare for the storm that was coming. The summer and autumn of 1941 were thus a paradox. For the Germans, a time of stunning victories, yet victories that planted the seeds of future failure. For the Soviets, a time of catastrophic losses, yet losses endured long enough to allow recovery. The Wehrmacht had advanced farther and faster than any army in history, but it had not broken the Soviet Union. The Red Army had been shattered again and again, but it had not ceased to exist. The front stretched across 1,000 miles, littered with wreckage, corpses, and shattered towns. Both sides were exhausted, yet both prepared for what was to come. The march from Belarus to the Dnieper was more than a campaign of conquest. It was a clash of worlds, of ideologies, of endurance. The Germans believed they were on the brink of victory. The Soviets, though battered, were beginning to realize that survival was possible, and survival could lead to eventual triumph. The stage was set for the showdown at Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, the prize Hitler most coveted, and the fortress Stalin would never abandon. The Red Army, though shocked and bloodied, had endured. The Wehrmacht, though victorious, was stretched and slowing. As autumn gave way to winter, the greatest battle of them all loomed ahead. The summer sun of 1941 beat down on the rolling fields and forests of western Russia as the German war machine pushed ever eastward. Behind them lay a trail of shattered towns, smoking ruins, and rivers clogged with wreckage. Ahead loomed the old city of Smolensk, a name already legendary in the annals of Russian defense. Napoleon had fought here more than a century earlier, and his march eastward had ended in disaster. Now Hitler's Wehrmacht, confident and unrelenting, approached the same ground with the same conviction that history would bend to their will. Yet the clash that unfolded at Smolensk would prove to be more than just another step toward date. Moscow. It would become a crucible, a test of endurance, and a harbinger of the long, grinding war to come. By July, German panzers had driven so far into Soviet territory that even their commanders marveled at the distances covered. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, spearheaded the advance toward Moscow. Two powerful panzer groups, led by Generals Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, were tasked with the classic blitzkrieg maneuver: cut deep into the Soviet rear, encircle entire armies, and destroy them in vast pockets before they could regroup. Infantry divisions followed, slower but relentless, securing the ground, guarding the supply lines, and mopping up isolated resistance. In theory, the strategy was working to perfection. Minsk had fallen. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners had already been captured. The Red Army appeared broken, unable to stand before the German onslaught. But the Soviet Union was not France, nor Belgium, nor Poland. Here, the land itself conspired against the invader. The forest seemed endless, masking movements and hiding partisans. Rivers ran wide and deep, their crossings easily fortified or destroyed. The roads, little more than rutted tracks, turned to dust in summer and would soon become quagmires with autumn rain. Most of all, the Soviet state, ruthless, brutal, but implacable, was willing to sacrifice millions to buy time. At Smolensk, this sacrifice began in earnest. The battle opened with terrifying speed. Guderian's panzers slashed north from the south, while Hoth's armored spearheads swung down from the north. The jaws of the encirclement snapped shut around Soviet forces positioned west of Smolensk. Entire armies, numbering hundreds of thousands, found themselves trapped in a tightening ring of steel. The Germans struck with precision, their tanks cutting across highways, their artillery smashing Soviet positions, and the Luftwaffe raining destruction from above. Soviet soldiers fought desperately, but their communications were in chaos, their orders contradictory, and their supply lines collapsing. Within days, the Smolensk pocket was born. Inside the cauldron, hell reigned. Soviet units, starved of food and ammunition, tried frantically to break out. Columns of men charged through forests, across open fields, into swamps and rivers, only to be cut down by German machine gun fire or torn apart by airstrikes. Horses collapsed under the weight of supply wagons. Medical stations, overwhelmed with wounded, burned as shells fell. The dead piled high in ditches and along roads. often left unburied as survivors pushed on in search of escape. For many Soviet soldiers, there was no choice but to fight to the last bullet. For others, capture was inevitable. Tens of thousands surrendered, joining the endless columns of prisoners, trudging westward, gaunt, exhausted, their faces blank with shock. And yet, not all were captured. Thousands slipped through the encirclement under cover of darkness, guided by local peasants or simply by desperation. These survivors often carried little more than their rifles and the clothes on their backs, but they refused to abandon the fight. Many joined partisan bands forming in the forests, swelling the ranks of the resistance. Others made their way eastward, reporting to new Soviet units that were already being formed. Though the Smolensk pocket was a devastating defeat, it did not crush the Red Army. Instead, it bled, adapted, and prepared for the next stand. For the Germans, the battle was both triumph and warning. On paper, it was another overwhelming victory. More than 200,000 prisoners taken, vast amounts of equipment captured, entire Soviet armies annihilated. Yet the cost and the delay troubled the high command. The battle raged for weeks, far longer than anticipated. Soviet resistance, though chaotic, was fierce and unrelenting. Units that should have collapsed held on stubbornly. Counterattacks erupted from unexpected directions, sometimes led by officers who had no communications with higher command, but who fought on instinct and determination. The Germans found themselves not only fighting encircled armies, but also fending off new Soviet forces rushing in from the east. Smolensk was supposed to be a swift victory. Instead, it became a grinding campaign that ate away at German strength and, more importantly, devoured precious time. Time was the enemy of the invader. Operation Barbarossa had been planned as a lightning war, to be won in weeks, before the onset of the Russian autumn and winter. The delays at Smolensk pushed that timetable back, inch by inch. Every week spent fighting here was a week closer to the rains, the snow, and the cold. German generals argued bitterly over strategy. Guderian wanted to press directly toward Moscow, to exploit momentum before it was lost. Others urged diversion of forces south toward Kiev, or north toward Leningrad, chasing Hitler's shifting obsessions. In Berlin, Hitler's patience with his generals wore thin. He raged against what he saw as their timidity, insisting that Moscow was not the only prize worth taking. On the Soviet side, Smolensk became a rallying cry. Stalin, still reeling from the disasters of June and July, seized on the battle as proof that the Red Army could resist. Propaganda hailed the defenders of Smolensk as heroes, even as entire armies vanished into captivity. Behind the lines, Moscow accelerated its preparations. Trenches were dug, barricades built, factories evacuated eastward. Civilians, school children, and elderly alike were pressed into labor, fortifying the capital. The bloodshed at Smolensk was not in vain. It bought time, the most precious resource of all. For the men on the ground, the battle was a nightmare of exhaustion and slaughter. German soldiers marched and fought without rest, pushing forward under constant pressure, often unsure where the next Soviet attack might come from. The heat of summer gave way to storms of rain, turning roads to rivers of mud. Vehicles bogged down, horses collapsed, supply lines faltered. Still, the German command demanded more. More advances, more encirclements, more prisoners. Soldiers grumbled that the war, promised as swift and decisive, already felt endless. They stared eastward at the horizon, knowing that Moscow lay still hundreds of kilometers away, and wondered how many battles like Smolensk would be required to reach it. For Soviet soldiers, the crucible forged something deeper. They had known panic in June, when the Germans seemed unstoppable, when orders were contradictory and retreats turned into routs. But at Smolensk, amid the horror, a grim determination set in. Soldiers spoke of vengeance, for comrades killed, for villages burned, for families lost. Officers, once paralyzed by fear of Stalin's purges, began to show initiative, rallying men even when cut off from higher command. The Red Army was still battered and disorganized, but it was learning how to fight the Germans, how to use the terrain, how to endure. As the battle wound down in late August, the Germans stood victorious, but their triumph was hollow. Smolensk was theirs, but the road to Moscow was not open. Instead, it stretched on, clogged with wreckage, dotted with new Soviet defensive lines, threatened by partisans in the forests and mud on the roads. The Wehrmacht had inflicted terrible losses, but it had not destroyed the Red Army. Worse, it had lost something intangible: the illusion of inevitability. For the first time, German officers began to whisper comparisons to Napoleon, who too had won at Smolensk, only to be undone by time, distance, and Russian resilience. The Smolensk crucible was thus more than a battle. It was a turning point of perception, a harbinger of the struggle to come. For the Germans, it revealed that victory would not be easy, that the Soviet Union would not collapse in a matter of weeks. For the Germans, awful Soviets, it proved that resistance was possible, that the invader could be delayed and bloodied. Between these realizations lay the seeds of the titanic clash that would soon erupt before Moscow. As the summer waned and autumn crept closer, both armies prepared for the next phase. The Germans reorganized, plotting their drive on Moscow, Operation Typhoon. The Soviets dug in, mobilizing every resource to defend their capital. The land between Smolensk and Moscow braced for the storm, knowing that the fate of nations would soon be decided there. The crucible of Smolensk had burned away illusions and forged a new reality. The war in the East would not be swift. It would be long, brutal, and merciless. And its outcome would determine the future of Europe, perhaps of the world itself. The land between Smolensk and Moscow became a battlefield long before the armies clashed again. It was not only the soldiers who fought here, not only the artillery, tanks, and bombers. It was the land itself, fields, rivers, forests, and villages that became both weapon and shield. For centuries, invaders had discovered that Russia could not be conquered by arms alone. It required mastery of distance, supply, and survival. Now, as German columns pressed eastward after the bitter fight for Smolensk, they would discover that every road, every bridge, every hamlet had been transformed into an obstacle, a trap, a bleeding wound. The Soviets, fighting with their backs to their capital, unleashed a policy as old as Russian history itself: the scorched earth. When Napoleon had marched on Moscow in 1812, Russian armies had retreated before him, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and denying the invaders anything that could sustain them. By the time the French emperor reached the city, he commanded a starving army deep in enemy territory. A century later, Stalin's generals revived that terrible doctrine. Orders went out to destroy everything that might be of use to the Germans. Grain stores were torched, wells poisoned, bridges and rail lines demolished, factories dismantled and shipped east, or, if that was impossible, reduced to rubble. What could not be carried away was burned. What could not be burned was broken. For the civilians caught between the retreating Red Army and the advancing Wehrmacht, the policy meant devastation. Families set fire to their own barns, slaughtered their animals, buried tools in fields. Villages were emptied overnight, their people herded eastward or dispersed into forests. The Germans, advancing with the expectation of living off the land, found instead a wasteland. Smoke hung in the air, fields lay blackened, wells ran dry. Hungry soldiers foraged in ruins, digging through ashes for potatoes or slaughtering stray animals that had escaped the torch. Every mile further east meant longer supply lines and fewer resources, until the Wehrmacht was forced to rely almost entirely on convoys of fuel and food stretching back hundreds of kilometers. The scorched earth policy was not simply destruction for its own sake. It was a deliberate strategy of attrition, denying the Germans the very tools they needed to sustain blitzkrieg. Mechanized war required fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts. Without them, Tanks became immobile hulks, trucks sat abandoned, and soldiers marched on empty stomachs. German planners had calculated that the land would feed their armies, that the conquest of Soviet territory would sustain the invasion. Stalin's order turned that assumption to dust. Every village that burned was a nail driven into the coffin of Hitler's dream of rapid conquest. Alongside this devastation rose the shadowy force of partisan warfare. Bands of irregular fighters, often peasants armed with rifles and grenades, sometimes veterans who had escaped encirclement, began to emerge in forests and marshes. Their numbers were small at first, but their impact immense. They struck supply convoys, blew up railway tracks, ambushed patrols. German soldiers, marching through seemingly empty countryside, learned to fear the crack of a rifle from the trees, or the sudden explosion of a mine under a convoy truck. For every kilometer of road secured, dozens of men had to be diverted from the front lines to guard it. For every train carrying fuel or ammunition, patrols had to sweep ahead to check for sabotage. Partisan warfare was not only a military tactic, it was psychological. It made the land itself seem hostile, alive with unseen enemies. Soldiers could never rest, never assume safety, even far behind the front. Villages that seemed peaceful by day might harbor fighters who struck at night. Bridges rebuilt by German engineers were blown apart again within days. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to clear battle lines and decisive engagements, now found itself harried by an enemy that melted into forests, struck without warning, and vanished. The men of the Wehrmacht had come east expecting conquest, glory, and the collapse of Soviet resistance. Instead, they found themselves trudging through fields of ash, watching the horizon shimmer with smoke. Soldiers marched hungry, their boots caked with mud, their uniforms damp from endless rain. Tanks bogged down in churned earth, trucks broke axles on ruined roads, horses collapsed under overloaded carts. Each day's advance brought not only combat, but the relentless grind of hunger, exhaustion, and the suspicion that every shadow hid an enemy. For the Soviets, the scorched earth was more than a strategy, it was a rallying cry. Propaganda declared that every peasant, every worker, every student had a role to play in defending the motherland. If they could not fight with rifles, they would fight with fire. If they could not march with the Red Army, they would deny the invaders food and shelter. Cities like Moscow became hives of mobilization, civilians digging trenches, building barricades, preparing for the fight they knew was coming. In the countryside, old men who remembered 1812 told young fighters how their fathers had burned crops before Napoleon's army. History, it seemed, was repeating itself, but now on a scale vaster than ever imagined. The Germans reacted with fury. Entire villages suspected of aiding partisans were destroyed, their inhabitants executed or deported. Reprisals became common, with civilians hanged from trees or shot as warnings. Yet the terror only deepened resistance. Families who had lost fathers and sons to German bullets joined the partisans with greater determination. Soviet propaganda broadcast tales of martyrdom and vengeance, weaving them into a narrative of resistance that inspired fighters across the vast expanse of the front. The scorched earth also revealed the first cracks in German strategy. Blitzkrieg had triumphed in Europe by delivering swift, decisive blows, breaking armies before they could regroup. But in Russia, victory was not measured in weeks or even months. The distances were vast, the terrain unforgiving, the enemy unyielding. Supply convoys stretched thin, vulnerable to attack. Delays mounted as bridges had to be rebuilt, roads cleared, railways repaired. Every hour spent on logistics was an hour stolen from momentum, and momentum was the lifeblood of Blitzkrieg. Commanders in the field grew anxious. Guderian pressed for continued advance, insisting that Moscow was within reach if only they kept pushing. Others argued for consolidation, fearing that the army was already overextended. Hitler, increasingly impatient, demanded results. His obsession with Moscow grew, even as his generals struggled to explain that the pace of advance was unsustainable. The scorched earth had turned speed into vulnerability. What had been the Wehrmacht's greatest strength now became its weakness. For the men of the Red Army, battered and retreating, the scorched earth bought time. Time for factories to move east, beyond the Urals, where they could continue producing tanks and rifles. Time for new divisions to form, for recruits to be trained, for Moscow's defenses to be strengthened. Time for the coming winter to descend, a weapon no less powerful than artillery or tanks. Every day, the Germans spent struggling through burned villages and sabotaged rail lines was another day closer to snow and frost. Stalin understood this. He cared little for the suffering of peasants or the destruction of homes. What mattered was survival, endurance, the preservation of the Soviet state. If villages burned, if millions were displaced, so be it. The war would be fought not only on the battlefield, but on the fields of grain and in the hearts of civilians. By September, the countryside west of Moscow was scarred beyond recognition. Blackened shells of houses stood like skeletons against the horizon. Fields, once golden with wheat, lay charred and barren. Roads were littered with burned-out vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned carts. The air smelled of smoke, rot, and despair. Yet amid this desolation, the Soviet spirit hardened. The invader could advance, but he would advance through ashes. He would conquer, but he would conquer a wasteland. For the Germans, the realization grew heavier with each passing week. They were no longer fighting an enemy army alone. They were fighting an entire nation. Every peasant woman who burned her own crops, every partisan who cut a railway line, every child who dug trenches around Moscow, was part of the Soviet war effort. It was a total war, one in which the front stretched not just across maps but across every field, every village, every family. The scorched earth awakening was thus more than a military policy. It was the transformation of the Soviet Union into a fortress of will, where survival meant destruction, where victory meant sacrifice. It was the turning of despair into resistance, of fire into weapon. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of a nightmare they had not anticipated. A war not only against soldiers, but against a people, a landscape, and a climate that conspired to bleed them dry. As the last days of summer slipped into autumn, the Germans stood at the edge of the greatest gamble of their campaign. Ahead lay Moscow, the glittering prize. Behind lay the wasteland of Smolensk, villages in ruins, supply lines stretched to breaking, morale strained by hunger and fatigue. The scorched earth had slowed them, drained them, and set the stage for what was to come. And what was to come was Operation Typhoon, the final lunge for Moscow, a gamble that would decide not only the fate of the capital but the fate of the war itself. The land itself had awakened, scorched and smoldering, to resist the invader. And the Wehrmacht, for all its power, would learn that no army marches undefeated across a country that has decided to burn itself rather than bow. The victories of summer 1941 had created an illusion inside the German high command, a vision of momentum that seemed unstoppable. Cities had fallen, Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners had marched westward in long defeated columns. From Minsk to Smolensk, the Wehrmacht appeared triumphant. Newspapers in Berlin proclaimed victory after victory, and Hitler himself boasted that the Soviet Union was nothing more than a colossus with feet of clay. Yet beneath the headlines and speeches, cracks had begun to appear. The further east the Germans pushed, the more fragile their achievements became. The victories were real, but they were not enough. They had come at a cost, and that cost was mounting. By September, the German army was discovering a terrible truth. They had advanced too far, too fast. They were overextended, and the empire they sought to conquer was far from collapsing. In the beginning, the Wehrmacht had relied on speed. Blitzkrieg was a doctrine of momentum, of rapid armored thrusts that shattered enemy lines, encircled formations, and created chaos behind the enemy front. It had worked brilliantly in France, where geography, population density, and relatively short distances made such operations feasible. It had worked in Poland and the Balkans, where enemy armies crumbled quickly and capitals fell within weeks. But in the Soviet Union, the distances were unlike anything the German planners had faced. From the Polish border to Moscow was over 1,000 kilometers. Roads were poor, railways limited, rivers numerous. Every advance carried the Wehrmacht deeper into a hostile wilderness, further from its supply bases and more vulnerable to breakdowns and counterattacks. Smolensk had been the first real taste of the challenge. The battle had raged for weeks, far longer than expected, and although the Germans eventually prevailed, their progress slowed. Divisions that had once advanced 50 kilometers a day now struggled to gain 5. The Soviet army, though battered and often clumsy, refused to collapse. Every encirclement destroyed one formation, but new units appeared behind it. Every city captured was a ruin, offering no sustenance or shelter. For the first time, German officers began to whisper doubts. If this was victory, what would defeat look like? The logistical situation grew dire. The German supply system depended heavily on railways, but the Soviet Union's tracks were of a different gauge. Every advance required engineers to tear up and rebuild kilometers of rail, an exhausting process that lagged far behind the front. Fuel trucks and horse-drawn wagons tried to fill the gap, but the distances were too great. Convoys stretched for miles, vulnerable to partisan ambushes and the ever-worsening roads. Tanks, the spearhead of blitzkrieg, guzzled fuel at alarming rates. Many sat idle for days, waiting for resupply, their crews cold and frustrated. Trucks broke down under the strain of endless journeys. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. The Wehrmacht had not prepared for a campaign of such magnitude, and the further east they advanced, the more their machines sputtered. Meanwhile, the Red Army was learning. The chaos of June and July had begun to give way to adaptation. Soviet commanders, though often inexperienced, studied the German methods and adjusted. They stopped throwing entire armies into futile frontal assaults. Instead, they traded space for time, retreating when necessary, counterattacking when opportunities arose, and forcing the Germans into costly engagements. Rear-guard actions delayed advances, partisans harassed supply lines, and factories dismantled in western cities were reassembled in the Urals. The longer the war dragged on, the stronger the Soviet Union became. Yet Hitler refused to see it. His vision remained fixed on Moscow. He believed that if the capital fell, the Soviet Union would collapse, just as France had after the fall of Paris. His generals, aware of the growing difficulties, urged caution. They spoke of the need to consolidate, to secure flanks, to rest divisions, and replenish supplies. But Hitler dismissed such concerns as weakness. He insisted that the army push forward, that victory was within reach. The tension between political ambition and military reality widened. Field commanders who had once basked in success now found themselves tasked with the impossible: to advance without pause, without supply, and without regard for the mounting costs. The soldiers felt the strain most keenly. They had marched for months, fought battle after battle, and now faced exhaustion. Uniforms were ragged, boots worn thin, food scarce. Letters home spoke of hunger, of fatigue, of endless marches through burned-out villages and forests haunted by partisans. The dream of a quick war faded, replaced by the grim realization that they were entangled in something vast and unyielding. The further they pushed, the more they wondered if there was an end at all. For the Soviet people, German overreach offered a glimmer of hope. Every day the invaders struggled was another day for Moscow to prepare. Civilians worked tirelessly, building fortifications, digging trenches, and producing weapons in factories that operated day and night. Stalin remained in the capital, a symbol of defiance. Propaganda proclaimed that Moscow would never fall, that the German beast would be broken on its walls. The people, though weary and terrified, believed because they had no choice. Survival demanded faith, and faith demanded sacrifice. The overreach also forced the Germans into cruelty. As supplies dwindled, They seized food from local populations, leaving civilians to starve. Villages were razed, their people deported or killed. The brutality was not only strategic but ideological. Hitler's war in the East was not merely conquest, it was annihilation, a war of races and ideology. Commissars were executed, Jews rounded up, entire communities destroyed. These atrocities, meant to terrify and pacify, often had the opposite effect. They hardened resistance, drove more men and women into the forests as partisans, and deepened the hatred that would fuel the Soviet war effort for years to come. By late September, as Operation Typhoon was prepared, the scale of German overreach was undeniable. The army was vast, its achievements impressive, but it was stretched to the breaking point. Supply lines ran like frayed threads across hundreds of kilometers. Divisions were under strength, equipment worn. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, now struggled to maintain superiority as distances grew and Soviet aircraft reappeared in increasing numbers. The weather turned against them. Autumn rains transforming roads into quagmires. Tanks bogged down, trucks sank, axle-deep in mud. Soldiers trudged through knee-high sludge. The Rasputitsa, the dreaded Russian mud season, had arrived, and with it, the final insult to the Wehrmacht's momentum. Still, Hitler pressed forward. Operation Typhoon would be the decisive blow, he declared. Moscow would fall, and with it, the Soviet Union. His generals obeyed, though many doubted. They saw the exhaustion in their men, the thinness of their lines, the impossibility of sustaining such an advance. They knew winter was coming, and with it, disaster. But in Hitler's Reich, dissent was dangerous. Orders were orders, and orders demanded movement. The irony of German overreach was that it created the very conditions for failure. By pushing so far, so fast, the Wehrmacht exposed itself to the unforgiving realities of geography, climate, and Soviet resilience. What had begun as a campaign of momentum became a campaign of attrition. The Germans were ill-prepared to fight. They had overestimated their strength, underestimated their enemy, and ignored the lessons of history. In the forests and villages of western Russia, the signs were everywhere. Burned fields, wrecked trucks, exhausted soldiers, starving civilians, ambushed convoys. The Germans were still advancing, but each step forward drained their strength. Each victory was smaller than the last, each gain harder won. The Red Army bled, but it endured. The Soviet Union staggered, but it did not fall. German overreach was not a sudden collapse but a slow, grinding erosion. It was the invisible weight of distance, the steady attrition of supply, the creeping despair of soldiers who realized they were too far from home, too deep in a hostile land, too dependent on a leader who demanded the impossible. It was the beginning of a truth that would haunt them for years. That the Soviet Union was not Poland, nor France, nor any enemy they had faced before. It was vast, unyielding, and merciless, and by overreaching, by believing in the illusion of invincibility, the Germans had doomed themselves to a struggle they could not win. By the end of September 1941, as the first winds of autumn swept across the Russian plains, the Wehrmacht prepared for the final lunge at Moscow. They believed it would be the decisive act, the culmination of their triumphs. Yet, even then, as tanks rumbled eastward and soldiers tightened their belts against hunger and cold, the seeds of failure had already been sown. German overreach had stretched their power beyond endurance. The Red Army and the Russian land itself had conspired to resist, and in that resistance lay the first faint outlines of a reversal that would one day drive the invaders back. The Wehrmacht had marched east with confidence, but now it marched into the unknown, into the jaws of winter, into the maw of a war that could not be won by speed alone. Blitzkrieg had met its limits, and beyond those limits lay the long, bitter struggle that would define the Eastern Front. The summer victories of 1941 had carried the Wehrmacht deep into the Soviet Union, and Smolensk stood as one of the bloodiest markers of that advance. The battle for the city itself had been costly, But what came afterward proved even more punishing. Beyond Smolensk lay not empty space, but a hinterland of forests, rivers, villages, and marshes that turned the German advance into a war of attrition. It was here, in the countryside surrounding Smolensk, that the dreams of blitzkrieg began to sink into the mud, where every road became a gauntlet, every bridge a trap, and every village a fortress or an ambush waiting to spring. The Germans had expected momentum. Instead, they found themselves in a grinding struggle that tested endurance as much as firepower. The terrain around Smolensk seemed designed to thwart mechanized warfare. The forests were thick, blocking the long lines of sight that German tanks and artillery relied upon. Rivers twisted through the landscape, forcing repeated crossings that consumed precious time and materials. Marshes and low-lying fields, dry in summer, turned treacherous with the autumn rains, bogging down trucks and horses alike. Villages dotted the countryside, their inhabitants often evacuated by Soviet authorities or burned out in scorched earth withdrawals, leaving nothing behind but ruins and hidden traps. Each kilometer gained came only after engineers cleared obstacles, infantry scouted for ambushes, and supply convoys crawled forward under constant threat. The Germans, who had gloried in sweeping maneuvers across the flat plains of Poland and France, now found themselves entangled in a hostile landscape that seemed to conspire with the defenders. The Red Army exploited this terrain with growing skill. Having learned from the disastrous early months of Operation Barbarossa, Soviet commanders deployed small rearguard units in forests and villages tasked with slowing the German advance. They struck suddenly with mortars and machine guns, then vanished into the woods. Bridges were blown as Germans approached, forcing hasty repairs under fire. Mines were planted on roads, derailing convoys and killing unsuspecting drivers. The Germans often found themselves fighting shadows, chasing elusive enemies who refused to stand and die in traditional battles. For every Soviet battalion destroyed, another appeared further east, dug in and ready to resist again. The Smolensk hinterland became less a battlefield than a labyrinth of delay and resistance, where German energy and morale slowly drained away. Partisan warfare added another layer to the nightmare. Even as German divisions pushed eastward, the countryside behind them refused to be pacified. Soviet partisans, peasants, former soldiers, communists, and ordinary citizens struck relentlessly at German supply lines. A single bridge, blown up by partisans, could delay an entire army's resupply for days. Convoys carrying food and ammunition were ambushed in narrow roads, flanked by forests, their trucks set ablaze before reinforcements could arrive. Rail lines, so vital to German logistics, were mined and derailed again and again. German garrisons in small towns found themselves under constant harassment, their men killed in nighttime raids or by snipers concealed in barns and haystacks. The partisans did not fight large battles. They bled the occupiers through constant pinpricks, death by 1,000 cuts that forced the Wehrmacht to divert men and resources to rear-area security. Each soldier guarding a supply convoy was one less fighting at the front. The German soldiers felt the strain acutely. They had marched east with songs on their lips, believing they would be home before Christmas. By the autumn of 1941, that illusion had vanished. Instead of victory parades, they trudged through mud and rain, hungry, tired, and uncertain of the future. Letters home spoke of exhaustion and despair. Boots wore out, uniforms tattered, food rations diminished. Soldiers scavenged for supplies in villages, often seizing food from civilians already on the brink of starvation. Frostbite began to appear as the first cold winds of winter blew across the plains. The sense of invincibility that had carried them through Poland and France dissolved into a grim struggle for survival, with the enemy invisible, the terrain hostile, and the weather merciless. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline and momentum. The doctrine of blitzkrieg required rapid advances and decisive battles, but Smolensk's hinterland offered only attrition and delay. Panzer divisions sat immobilized by lack of fuel. their tanks rusting in fields, while infantry slogged forward on foot. Engineers were worked to exhaustion, building bridges, clearing mines, and repairing roads that collapsed again after each rain. Artillery units were forced to conserve ammunition, their supply trains constantly disrupted. Luftwaffe support, once the hammer of German offensives, was hampered by worsening weather and increasing Soviet resistance in the skies. Every aspect of the German war machine was strained, not by a single decisive battle, but by the cumulative effect of countless small delays, ambushes, and natural obstacles. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, gained strength from these delays. Every day that the tension, Germans were slowed bought time for reinforcements to arrive from the east, for factories in the Urals to produce more tanks and planes, and for Moscow to prepare its defenses. Stalin and his generals recognized the value of attrition. They did not need to win every battle, they only needed to prevent the Germans from winning quickly. The scorched earth policy ensured that the Germans found no shelter, no supplies, and no easy victories in the countryside. Villages were burned before the Wehrmacht arrived, fields stripped of crops, wells poisoned. Civilians joined the resistance or vanished into the forests, leaving behind nothing but ruins. The land itself became a weapon, wielded with ruthless determination. The psychological dimension of the struggle cannot be overstated. For the Germans, each delay eroded morale and confidence. They had believed in their own superiority, in the myth of invincibility. But in the forests and swamps around Smolensk, they faced an enemy who refused to play by their rules. The Soviets fought not for tactical advantage, but for survival, and that made them unpredictable and relentless. For the Soviets, each day of resistance, each successful ambush or delay, built confidence. They saw that the Germans could be slowed, that their machines could break down, that their soldiers could tire and despair. The myth of German invincibility began to crack, replaced by the growing belief that the invaders could be defeated. By late September, the weather turned against the Germans decisively. The Rasputitsa, the dreaded season of mud, arrived. Rain fell in sheets, turning dirt roads into rivers of muck. Trucks sank to their axles, horses collapsed, trying to pull wagons, and soldiers waded through waist-deep mud, carrying rifles and equipment. Tanks, the pride of blitzkrieg, were rendered useless in many areas, their tracks churning mud but moving nowhere. Entire divisions ground to a halt, not from enemy fire, but from the sheer weight of nature itself. The German timetable for capturing Moscow slipped further and further behind. What had been envisioned as a lightning strike now became a nightmare of immobility, exhaustion, and frustration. The Soviets seized every opportunity to exploit the mud and chaos. Rearguard units struck immobilized columns, artillery shelled stalled convoys, and partisans set fire to abandoned vehicles. Frozen rivers, once obstacles, became highways for Soviet movement, allowing them to maneuver where Germans could not. The very environment became a weapon wielded by the defenders, amplifying the effects of their resistance. German soldiers wrote bitterly that they were not fighting men, but mud, rain, and endless forests. The Wehrmacht had conquered much of Europe, but in the Russian hinterland they were humbled by terrain as much as by enemy fire. In Berlin, Hitler remained convinced that Moscow must fall. He dismissed reports of overextension and exhaustion as excuses. He demanded renewed effort, new offensives, new victories. His generals, though increasingly alarmed, obeyed. They understood that their army was stretched beyond endurance, but they also understood the political reality. To defy Hitler was to risk ruin. And so the army pressed on, further into the mud, further into exhaustion, further into the jaws of a winter that was already approaching. The Smolensk hinterland thus became a crucible, a place where German overreach met Soviet resilience, where the myth of blitzkrieg was undone by mud and forests, and where the seeds of eventual defeat were sown. Every mile gained drained strength that could not be replaced. Every delay gave the Soviets time to prepare. Every ambush chipped away at the aura of invincibility. The Germans still believed they could reach Moscow, but the reality on the ground told a different story. Their advance had slowed, their men were tired, their supplies stretched, and their enemy more determined than ever. In the end, the struggle, in the Smolensk hinterland, was not about the capture of a single city or the destruction of a single army. It was about the transformation of the war itself. What had begun as a lightning campaign became a war of attrition. What had seemed inevitable now became uncertain. The Germans were still powerful, still dangerous, still advancing, but they were no longer unstoppable. The Red Army and the Russian land had shown that momentum could be slowed, that invincibility was an illusion, and that the war in the east would be long, brutal, and far from decided. The roads beyond Smolensk led to Moscow, but they were roads of mud, blood, and exhaustion. The Germans trudged onward, their eyes fixed on the distant prize, but each step carried them deeper into a struggle they could not yet comprehend. In the forests and villages of the hinterland, history had shifted. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength, its speed had been neutralized, and from that moment onward, the balance of the war began to tilt, slowly, but inexorably, against them. By the early days of October 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at the threshold of what was supposed to be its crowning achievement in the East. The campaign to conquer the Soviet Union had begun with immense promise in June, and although summer victories had been staggering in scale, they had not yet delivered the decisive knockout blow Hitler demanded. Now, Operation Typhoon, the grand assault on Moscow, was meant to deliver that victory. For Hitler and his generals, the Soviet capital was not merely another city. It was a symbol, a nerve center of communications, industry, and politics. Its fall, they believed, would cripple the Red Army and shatter Soviet morale. In their eyes, Moscow was the heart of the enemy, and if the heart stopped beating, the body would collapse. The planning for Operation Typhoon reflected both ambition and desperation. The Wehrmacht's divisions were stretched thin, exhausted by months of constant marching and distracted fighting, and yet they were once again tasked with an immense offensive. Hitler demanded that Moscow fall before the winter. He ignored the realities of supply shortages, the exhaustion of the men, and the worsening weather. To him, victory was a matter of willpower and faith in the superiority of German arms. His generals, though increasingly concerned, did not openly oppose him. They saw the risks, but they also understood that hesitation was not an option. Moscow had to be taken, no matter the cost. On 2 October 1941, Operation Typhoon began. The offensive opened with a massive assault along the Central Front, involving nearly 2 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and overwhelming air support. The Wehrmacht struck with the ferocity that had characterized its earlier campaigns, determined to encircle Soviet forces and clear the path to Moscow. And at first, the results seemed spectacular. Entire Soviet armies were caught in vast encirclements. At Vyazma and Bryansk, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were trapped, their positions overrun, their retreat cut off. German propaganda proclaimed another great victory, boasting of destroyed divisions, captured prisoners, and the imminent collapse of Soviet defenses. The road to Moscow appeared open, and for a brief moment the illusion of unstoppable momentum returned. But behind the numbers, the reality was far less decisive. The Soviet forces at Vyazma and Bryansk fought with unexpected tenacity. Encircled units did not surrender quietly. They resisted from pockets of forests, from burned-out villages, and from hastily dug trenches. Fighting raged for days, tying down German divisions that had been intended for the advance on Moscow. Every battalion left to contain Soviet pockets was one less battalion available to push forward. The encirclements consumed time, and time was the one resource Germany could not afford to lose. The autumn rains had begun, turning roads into mud, and every delay worsened the logistical nightmare. The victory at Vyazma, though impressive on paper, came at the cost of momentum. Meanwhile, the Red Army refused to break. Stalin and his generals had anticipated the German push toward Moscow and had prepared successive lines of defense. Fresh divisions, many rushed from Siberia and the Far East, after intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack, began to arrive. These Siberian troops, hardened by harsh climates, were well trained and well equipped for winter warfare. They were thrown into the fight around Moscow with ruthless efficiency, bolstering the defense just as German divisions were exhausting themselves. The Soviet leadership understood that Moscow must be held at any cost. Factories and civilians were mobilized to build fortifications, dig trenches, and lay barbed wire. Anti-tank ditches encircled the city, and defenses were layered in depth. The Germans had expected collapse. Instead, they encountered determination. For the German soldiers, the advance of Operation Typhoon was both triumphant and grueling. The initial victories filled them with hope, but the march eastward soon became a nightmare. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Trucks broke down, horses died in the mud, and fuel was consumed faster than it could be delivered. Ammunition had to be rationed, food grew scarce, and the men marched hungry. Villages that might have offered shelter were often burned to the ground by retreating Soviets. Partisans harassed their columns, cutting rail lines and ambushing convoys. The further the Wehrmacht advanced, the weaker it became, until its once overwhelming force was reduced to exhausted divisions staggering toward a distant prize. The weather turned against them with merciless consistency. The Rasputitsa, the autumn mud, was at its peak. Entire armored columns bogged down in quagmires, tanks immobilized in fields of muck, supply wagons abandoned on impassable roads. Soldiers trudged through knee-deep mud, their boots rotting, their strength sapped. Progress slowed to a crawl, and each kilometer toward Moscow was paid for in sweat, blood, and despair. German officers wrote bitterly of the conditions, admitting privately that their army had underestimated the Russian land itself, which seemed to fight alongside the Red Army. Yet Hitler refused to relent. Reports of exhaustion and shortages were dismissed as defeatism. He insisted that Moscow was within reach, that victory was inevitable if only the army pressed harder. Orders flowed from the Führer's headquarters with the same rigid optimism: advance, attack, encircle, destroy. Field commanders, who understood the realities on the ground, obeyed reluctantly. They had no choice. To disobey was unthinkable, and so they pushed their men forward into the mud, into the cold, and into the increasingly determined Soviet defenses. The Soviets seized every opportunity to strike back. As German forces slowed, counterattacks erupted along the flanks. Small Soviet units struck supply convoys, artillery shelled German positions, and partisan activity intensified. The longer the Germans took to reach Moscow, the stronger the Soviet defenses became. Fresh divisions arrived daily, fortifications deepened, and morale soared. Stalin remained in the capital, refusing to evacuate, a symbol of defiance that rallied both civilians and soldiers. Propaganda proclaimed that Moscow would never fall, and the people believed it because they had no other choice. Every citizen became part of the defense, whether digging ditches, building barricades, or manufacturing weapons. The German advance was met not just by soldiers, but by an entire nation determined to resist. By late October, the situation for the Wehrmacht grew dire. The initial encirclements had failed to destroy the Red Army. The mud had slowed the advance to a crawl. Supplies were running out. Winter loomed. Yet still they pressed forward, desperate to seize Moscow before the Bia. Snow fell. Soldiers wrapped themselves in makeshift winter clothing scavenged from civilians or looted from supply depots. Frostbite began to claim victims. Weapons jammed in the cold, and vehicles froze overnight. The army that had conquered France in a matter of weeks now struggled to move at all. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had once believed in their own invincibility now faced despair. They saw comrades collapse from exhaustion, horses dying in the mud, tanks abandoned in fields. They wrote letters home filled with bitterness, admitting that the war was not the glorious crusade they had imagined, but a nightmare of hunger, cold, and endless struggle. Morale faltered, discipline wavered, and yet the orders to advance continued. The Soviets, in contrast, drew strength from the struggle. Every day the Germans failed to capture Moscow was a victory in itself. Each successful defense, each counterattack, each ambush built confidence. The Red Army had suffered immense losses, but it had not broken. It was learning, adapting, and growing stronger. For the first time, Soviet soldiers began to believe not only that they could survive, but that they could win. Operation Typhoon, meant to be the decisive blow, became instead a symbol of German overreach. The offensive had begun with sweeping encirclements and promises of imminent victory, but by November it had devolved into a slog through mud and snow against defenses that refused to yield. The Germans were advancing, but at a cost they could not sustain. Every kilometer closer to Moscow left them weaker, hungrier, colder. Every day they delayed gave the Soviets more time to prepare. By the time the first snow fell in early November, the illusion of momentum had evaporated. The Wehrmacht stood within sight of Moscow, but it was exhausted, undersupplied, and ill-prepared for the winter that now descended. The offensive was not yet over, but the seeds of its failure were already sown. The Germans had gambled everything on Operation Typhoon, and in doing so, they had overextended themselves to the breaking point. Moscow remained defiant, and the Red Army stood ready to fight to the death. What had begun as a campaign of speed and decisive victories had become a war of endurance. The Wehrmacht was still formidable, but it was no longer invincible. Operation Typhoon, the great push for Moscow, would soon reveal not the strength of German arms, but the limits of ambition when confronted by distance, weather, and an enemy unwilling to yield. The first snow came early that year, drifting down across the Russian plains in late October and early November, as if summoned to bury the German dream of swift victory. At first, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht welcomed it, for the snow hardened the muddy roads that had swallowed trucks and tanks during the autumn rains. Vehicles could move again, horses no longer sank knee-deep in muck, and the army began to advance once more. But what seemed like a reprieve quickly turned into a curse. The snow thickened, the cold deepened, and the campaign that was supposed to culminate in triumph before winter instead became a desperate struggle for survival. For the men in the field, the reality was brutal. German troops had been told the war would be over before the winter. They had not been issued proper winter clothing. Many marched in summer uniforms, their thin boots offering little protection against the ice and snow. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet, draped blankets over their shoulders, and scavenged fur coats from abandoned villages to stave off the cold. But nothing could fully protect them from temperatures that plunged far below freezing. Frostbite spread through the ranks, claiming fingers, toes, and entire limbs. Men who had survived the fiercest battles now found themselves incapacitated by the merciless climate. The cold also turned machinery into lifeless hulks. Engines refused to start, oil thickened, and lubricants froze solid. Tanks, which had once spearheaded the blitzkrieg, sat immobilized, their steel tracks locked by ice. Trucks stalled along the roadside, abandoned when fuel ran out or engines froze. Artillery pieces cracked in the cold, their breeches jammed, while rifles and machine guns often refused to fire. German soldiers huddled around small fires, desperate to warm their weapons, even as they risked drawing Soviet artillery or sniper fire. What had been a modern mechanized army was slowly being reduced to a shivering mass of infantry, trudging forward on foot through waist-deep snow. The Red Army, by contrast, was prepared. Their soldiers had been issued winter coats, padded boots, and gloves. Their equipment was designed to function in sub-zero temperatures, and their tactics adapted to the frozen landscape. They used skis to move swiftly across snow, while horses pulled sledges loaded with supplies and ammunition. The Soviet soldiers were not immune to hardship, but they were acclimated and resilient. Winter was not an obstacle for them, it was an ally. The Germans had come to Russia believing they would conquer its people, but now they were being conquered by its land and its climate. As the Germans pushed toward Moscow in November, the combination of cold, exhaustion, and relentless resistance began to erode their strength. Every kilometer gained was a battle in itself. Villages were fortified by Soviet defenders who fought street by street, house by house, forcing the Germans into costly assaults. Forests became deadly ambush sites where hidden artillery and machine guns tore into advancing columns. Rivers, now frozen, were treacherous to cross, their ice too thin to support tanks but too thick to break easily. Everywhere, nature conspired with the Red Army to slow the invaders' advance. Supply lines, already stretched to the breaking point, collapsed under the strain of winter. Fuel froze in barrels, food spoiled or was stolen by desperate men, and ammunition dwindled. Supply convoys struggled to reach the front, their trucks breaking down or bogging in snow, their drivers harassed by partisan attacks. Horses, once the backbone of German logistics, began to die in the cold, their carcasses littering the frozen roadsides. Hungry soldiers cut meat from the dead animals, boiling it over makeshift fires to keep themselves alive. Starvation loomed, and with it came despair. Letters home reflected the growing sense of hopelessness. Soldiers wrote of endless marches through snow, of comrades collapsing from exhaustion, of nights spent in open fields with no shelter. The temperature dropping to levels they had never experienced. They spoke of frostbitten feet turning black, of officers struggling to maintain discipline, of the constant fear that the next dawn might bring another Soviet counterattack. Many admitted privately what few dared say aloud: Moscow was no longer within reach. And yet, Hitler demanded that the offensive continue. In his headquarters far from the front, he raged against what he saw as weakness, ordering his generals to press on at all costs. He believed the Soviets were on the verge of collapse, that one more push would bring victory. His orders were absolute, his confidence unshaken by reality. But for the soldiers on the ground, each new order to attack felt like a death sentence. They were no longer advancing with the speed and ferocity of blitzkrieg. They were dragging themselves forward, step by painful step, through a frozen wasteland. The Soviets exploited every weakness. They launched counterattacks along the flanks, striking German units that had overextended themselves. Small mobile detachments on skis harassed supply lines, striking at night and disappearing into the forests before the Germans could respond. Partisans ambushed convoys, blew up bridges, and cut telegraph lines, ensuring that German commanders struggled to coordinate their operations. Even as the Wehrmacht pushed closer to Moscow, it was being bled dry by 1,000 cuts. Inside Moscow, the mood had transformed. In October, panic had spread as the Germans advanced within sight of the city. Civilians had fled in droves, and rumors of evacuation had shaken confidence. But by November, the city had become a fortress. Trenches encircled the capital. Barbed wire and anti-tank obstacles lined its approaches, and entire neighborhoods had been turned into strongpoints. Civilians who remained in the city worked tirelessly to support the defense, building barricades, digging ditches, and producing weapons in factories that ran day and night. Stalin stayed in Moscow, broadcasting his presence to reassure the population and strengthen morale. His defiance became a rallying point, convincing both soldiers and civilians that the capital would never fall. As November turned to December, the Germans reached the outer defenses of Moscow. They were closer than ever, but also weaker than ever. Their divisions were reduced to fragments, their tanks immobilized, their soldiers starving and freezing. The offensive that was supposed to deliver a swift and decisive victory had become a nightmare. The Wehrmacht was still advancing, but it no longer had the strength to finish what it had begun. For the Soviets, the moment of opportunity was approaching. They had endured the worst of the German assault and survived. Reinforcements from Siberia were arriving in greater numbers, fresh troops with winter gear and high morale. Their presence gave the Red Army the strength to consider not just defense, but counterattack. Soviet commanders watched as the Germans struggled, noting their exhaustion, their lack of supplies, their vulnerability to the cold. The time was coming when the defenders would become the attackers, when the invader would be forced to retreat. The German soldiers at the front could feel it too. They saw the growing confidence of their enemies, the fresh troops appearing in Soviet lines, the constant harassing attacks that never seemed to stop. They fought on, but their faith in victory was fading. The freezing wind that cut across the steppes carried with it a realization that chilled them more deeply than the cold. Moscow would not fall. They might reach its gates, but they would not enter. By December, the reality was undeniable. Operation Typhoon had stalled. The Wehrmacht had advanced to within sight of the Kremlin's spires, but it had no strength left to capture them. The German army stood frozen on the threshold of Moscow, exhausted, starving, and ill-prepared for the winter that had only just begun. The Soviets were battered but unbroken, and now they were ready to strike back. The onset of winter had done what Soviet divisions alone could not. It had broken the momentum of the German offensive. Blitzkrieg had ended in the snow. The Wehrmacht, once the terror of Europe, was now learning the cost of hubris, overextension, and underestimation of an enemy that refused to collapse. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history, as the Red Army prepared to launch the counteroffensive that would drive the Germans back from Moscow and change the course of the war. The morning of the 5th of December 1941 broke over the Russian plains with a bitter cold that seemed to pierce flesh and bone. The temperature had fallen to nearly -30 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that could freeze a man's breath in mid-air and silence an army without a shot being fired. For weeks, the Wehrmacht had clawed its way toward Moscow. Exhausted and starving, its advance slowed to a crawl. German soldiers stood in the snow with frost-bitten fingers, staring at the distant spires of Moscow that gleamed faintly in the winter sun. So close, yet impossibly far. They believed they might have reached the end of their strength, that the long nightmare of marching east would finally consume them in the cold. What they did not know was that the nightmare was about to get worse. The Red Army was ready to strike back. The Soviet counteroffensive had been carefully prepared, in silence and secrecy. While the Germans bled themselves dry in their desperate push toward Moscow, Soviet commanders had been gathering strength. Fresh divisions, redeployed from the Far East, where Stalin had been assured that Japan would not attack, arrived in Moscow with their white winter uniforms, their skis, and their hardened experience of surviving in harsh conditions. They were a different kind of soldier from the ragged remnants defending Moscow's outskirts, disciplined, rested, and ready for battle. Their arrival transformed the balance of power. For the first time in months, the Red Army had more men in the field around Moscow than the Wehrmacht. For the first time, the Soviets had the initiative. The plan was simple in its conception, but audacious in execution. Soviet forces would launch simultaneous counterattacks along the length of the front, striking at German units that were stretched thin, exhausted, and vulnerable. Rather than one decisive blow, the Red Army would deliver many, hammering at German lines until they cracked. The Siberian divisions would spearhead these attacks, using their mobility and experience in winter warfare to outmaneuver the frozen enemy. Cavalry units, long dismissed as obsolete by modern armies, would charge through snow and forests, harassing German flanks and cutting supply lines. Partisans behind the lines would intensify their raids, ensuring that the Germans could not rest or regroup. The offensive was timed not just to exploit the German exhaustion, but also to harness the brutal power of winter itself. When the attack came, it was like a thunderclap in the frozen silence. Soviet artillery opened fire along vast stretches of the front, the booming of the guns echoing across snow-covered forests and fields. Shells exploded among German positions, tearing apart trenches and scattering men who had been huddled together for warmth. Then the infantry came, waves of Red Army soldiers advancing with rifles, bayonets, and grenades. their white uniforms blending with the snow, making them seem like ghosts rising from the frozen earth. Ski battalions glided silently across fields and forests, appearing suddenly at the flanks of German positions, striking with speed and disappearing just as quickly. Tanks, their engines adapted to the cold, rumbled forward across the snow, their turrets spitting fire. For the Germans, it was as though the earth itself had turned against them. The Wehrmacht, caught off guard, reeled under the onslaught. For months they had been the attackers, dictating the tempo of battle, driving the Red Army backward. Now, they were the ones being driven. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to advancing suddenly found themselves retreating, abandoning trenches, equipment, and comrades in the face of relentless Soviet pressure. Entire divisions staggered backward, their cohesion breaking as Soviet units struck from multiple directions. For the first time since the campaign began, the Germans were not advancing but fleeing, their long, frozen supply lines snapping under the strain. The shock was profound. German commanders had believed the Soviets were on the verge of collapse, that one more push would bring Moscow into their hands. Instead, they found themselves confronted by an enemy, stronger, fresher, and more determined than ever before. Reports flooded headquarters of Soviet attacks along the front, of divisions cut off and encircled, of supply depots destroyed, of soldiers freezing to death in the snow. The aura of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht from Poland to the gates of Moscow began to shatter. For the Soviet soldiers, the counteroffensive was more than just a military operation, it was revenge. They remembered the villages burned by German troops, the executions carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, the humiliation of Kummen, retreating across their own land. Now the tide had turned, and with it came a surge of morale and fury. Soldiers shouted battle cries as they charged, civilians cheered as villages were liberated, and partisan bands stepped up their attacks, knowing the Germans were finally on the defensive. Each mile reclaimed was not just territory, it was vindication, proof that the invaders could be stopped, proof that the Soviet Union would endure. The impact of the counteroffensive was felt not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of men. For German soldiers, the realization that they were retreating for the first time in the war was devastating. Letters home, once filled with confidence and talk of victory, now spoke of exhaustion, fear, and despair. Men who had once believed in Hitler's promises of swift conquest began to whisper comparisons to Napoleon's doomed march into Russia, another great army humbled by the Russian winter. Officers struggled to maintain discipline, but no amount of harsh words or punishments could disguise the truth. They were losing. The retreat was chaotic and brutal. German units pulled back through snow and ice, abandoning tanks, artillery, and trucks that had frozen solid or run out of fuel. Roads became choked with columns of soldiers trudging on foot, their faces pale with frostbite, their eyes hollow with fatigue. Behind them, Soviet artillery pounded relentlessly, while ski battalions and cavalry slashed at their flanks. Villages once occupied by the Germans were recaptured, their people emerging from hiding to greet Soviet troops with tears and cheers. Every step backward for the Wehrmacht was a step forward for the Red Army, and the symbolism of this reversal was as powerful as the military results. Hitler's response to the disaster was predictable. He raged at his generals, refusing to allow organized withdrawals, insisting that his troops hold their ground at all costs. To retreat was, in his mind, weakness. To stand, firm, even in the face of disaster, was strength. Orders went out forbidding any withdrawals without explicit approval, forcing German commanders to choose between disobedience and annihilation. In many cases, this stubbornness turned setbacks into catastrophes, as divisions ordered to stand their ground were surrounded and destroyed by Soviet attacks. Yet even Hitler could not deny the scale of the crisis. Army Group Center, the mighty spearhead that had been tasked with capturing Moscow, was now in danger of collapse. The Red Army pressed relentlessly, recapturing towns and villages, pushing the Germans further from the capital with each passing day. The dream of raising the swastika over the Kremlin was gone, replaced by the grim reality of survival. The Germans had been beaten back, not just by the Red Army, but by their own hubris, their failure to prepare for winter, and the unforgiving Russian land itself. For the Soviets, the counteroffensive was more than a battlefield success. It was a symbol of survival, proof that the Soviet Union could endure the worst and still strike back. Propaganda celebrated the victory with fervor, proclaiming to the world that the fascist beast had been stopped at the gates of Moscow. Stalin, once criticized for his failures in the early months of the war, now stood vindicated, his decision to remain in Moscow during the darkest days seen as a mark of courage and leadership. The defense of the capital became a legend, woven into the fabric of Soviet identity for generations to come. The counteroffensive did not end the war. It was only the beginning of a long and brutal struggle that would last years. But it marked the first great turning point. The Wehrmacht had suffered its first major defeat on land, and the myth of its invincibility was broken. Across the world, the news of Moscow's survival and the German retreat reverberated. In London, Churchill hailed it as proof that Hitler could be beaten. In Washington, Roosevelt drew confidence as America entered the war after Pearl Harbor. Resistance movements in occupied Europe took heart, believing that liberation was possible. The tide of history, which had seemed to flow only in Hitler's favor, had begun to turn. By the end of December, the Germans had been driven back more than 100 miles from Moscow. The Red Army, though bloodied and battered, stood stronger than ever. The snow-covered fields around the capital bore silent witness to the failure of Operation Typhoon, to the broken dreams of a swift German victory. The Soviets had not just defended their city, they had shown the world that the war was far from over, that the Nazi war machine could be stopped, and that from the frozen ruins of 1941, a new path to eventual victory had begun. The Soviet counteroffensive was the opening chapter of that path, a story of resilience, preparation, and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. It was the moment when the hunted became the hunter, when survival turned into resistance, and when Moscow became not just a city, but a symbol of defiance. The Red Army had struck back, and history itself had shifted in the snow. The frozen roads west of Moscow in December 1941 became graveyards for the Wehrmacht. What had begun as a triumphal march into the Soviet Union now turned into a staggering, disordered withdrawal under the relentless pressure of the Red Army and the merciless bite of winter. Tanks once roaring with speed were now abandoned hulks, their engines seized by the cold. Horses lay dead along the roadside, their bodies stiff with frost, while starving men scavenged what little meat remained. Villages that had served as German garrisons were deserted, doors left swinging open, frozen fires still smoldering, as retreating soldiers abandoned their posts in haste. The invaders who had come with dreams of a quick conquest were now retreating step by bloody step, leaving behind a trail of wreckage and despair. The retreat was not orderly. It was a chaos of broken formations, collapsing supply lines, and men marching in silence with hollow eyes. German officers tried desperately to impose discipline, shouting orders over the howling wind, but the scale of exhaustion was overwhelming. Soldiers had been on campaign since June, marching thousands of kilometers through forests, rivers, and endless plains. They had fought battles at Minsk, Smolensk, Vyazma, and the gates of Moscow itself. Now, with winter gnawing at their bones and the Red Army surging forward, even the most disciplined units felt the weight of futility. Every backward step was a bitter admission that the great gamble of Operation Barbarossa had failed to deliver its prize. Soviet soldiers pressed the retreat with fury. Ski battalions appeared suddenly from forests, firing on columns and vanishing back into the snow. Cavalry galloped through open plains, their sabers flashing, cutting into German flanks and sowing panic. Artillery thundered across frozen fields, targeting bridges, crossroads, and retreat routes to choke the Wehrmacht's movements. Partisan bands swelled in numbers, emboldened by the German collapse, striking convoys, cutting telegraph wires, and ambushing isolated units. The Germans were no longer masters of the battlefield but prey, hounded at every turn by a foe they had underestimated. The retreat carried with it the crushing weight of logistical failure. Fuel had always been the lifeblood of the German army, powering the panzers that spearheaded its blitzkrieg campaigns. But now, with supply lines stretched over hundreds of miles of devastated countryside, fuel was almost non-existent. Tanks and trucks froze or ran dry, abandoned in ditches and fields. Infantrymen trudged past these steel carcasses with resignation, knowing each abandoned vehicle marked not just a loss of equipment, but a loss of speed, a loss of hope. Ammunition was equally scarce. Soldiers counted their bullets carefully, reserving them for desperate moments of defense. Many resorted to scavenging from the dead, both friend and foe. The proud, mechanized army of Hitler was reduced to a shivering mass of men trudging through snow, hungry, cold, and armed with whatever scraps they could carry. The human toll was immense. Frostbite claimed thousands of fingers, toes, and lives. Soldiers collapsed on the roadside, their bodies freezing in grotesque postures that remained untouched by their comrades, for no one had the strength to bury them. Medical services were overwhelmed, bandages frozen stiff, morphine exhausted. Wounded men who once might have been saved were left to die in the snow. The retreat became a march of the living dead, where each step forward required abandoning the weak, the injured, the frozen. Letters recovered from German soldiers spoke of despair. "We no longer fight for victory," wrote one infantryman. "We fight only to stay alive another day." Morale crumbled. The aura of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht from Warsaw to Paris, from the Low Countries to the gates of Moscow, now shattered in the icy winds of the Russian winter. Soldiers compared their plight to Napoleon's doomed invasion more than a century earlier, whispering that history was repeating itself. Even hardened officers, once confident in the superiority of German arms and planning, now questioned the wisdom of their mission. Some cursed Hitler for demanding continued attacks when retreat was inevitable. Others cursed the land itself, this vast, unyielding expanse that swallowed armies whole. For many, the belief in ultimate victory so strong only months before was replaced by a gnawing awareness of mortality. Hitler's orders exacerbated the suffering. Furious at the retreat, he demanded that no ground be given up voluntarily. He insisted that German units stand fast, fight to the last man, and never yield. For commanders on the ground, these orders were impossible to obey. Units too weak to hold were annihilated when forced to stand their ground, encircled and destroyed by Soviet attacks. Others retreated in defiance of orders, preferring dishonor to annihilation. The rift between Hitler's vision of unbreakable resolve and the grim reality of the battlefield widened, sowing distrust between the dictator and his generals. What had once seemed a flawless war machine now revealed its fractures under the stress of failure. For the Soviets, the German retreat was more than a military opportunity. It was a psychological triumph. Civilians emerged from cellars and forests, gaunt and pale, to greet the Red Army with tears and embraces. Villages long under German occupation erupted with cries of joy as Soviet flags were raised once more. Stories of atrocities committed by the occupiers, executions, burned houses, stolen harvests, fueled the rage of advancing soldiers, who fought with a renewed determination to drive the invaders further west. Each village reclaimed was not just a tactical victory, but a symbol of endurance, proof that the tide of war had turned. The Soviets pressed their advantage ruthlessly. Zhukov and other commanders pushed their troops hard, knowing the Germans would eventually recover and re-establish defensive lines. The winter was their ally, and they had to exploit it fully. Soviet columns advanced across snow and ice, their supply lines shorter and better prepared, their men equipped with fur-lined coats and felt boots. They too suffered from the cold, from hunger and exhaustion, but the knowledge that they were advancing, that they were reclaiming their land, sustained them. For the first time since the war began, the Red Army held the initiative, and they wielded it with fury. But the retreat was not a rout. Despite their suffering, the Germans were still formidable. Skilled commanders organized defensive rearguards, setting ambushes, laying mines, and using what artillery remained to slow the Soviet advance. At towns like Rzhev and Vyazma, German units dug in and fought savagely, turning villages into fortresses, forcing the Red Army into bloody, close-quarters battles. These defensive stands inflicted heavy casualties, reminding the Soviets that the enemy, though battered, was not broken. The retreat bled the Wehrmacht, but it did not destroy it. Still, the consequences of the retreat were undeniable. Hitler's dream of capturing Moscow in 1941 was dead. The myth of blitzkrieg, that war could be won quickly, with speed and precision, was shattered on the icy roads west of the capital. Germany now faced a long war of attrition against an enemy whose resources, manpower, and resilience had been gravely underestimated. The retreat marked the end of the illusion that the Soviet Union could be defeated in a single campaign. Instead, the Eastern Front had become a vast and brutal struggle that would consume millions of lives and determine the fate of Europe. The symbolic weight of Moscow's survival cannot be overstated. In October, the city had trembled on the brink of collapse, with civilians preparing for evacuation and government offices fleeing east. By January, it stood secure, its people triumphant, its defenders exalted as heroes. The Soviet Union broadcast its victory across the world, showing that Hitler's armies could be stopped. In London, Churchill praised the Soviet stand as a turning point in the war. In Washington, Roosevelt found reassurance that the Soviet Union, now an ally, was a partner worth supporting with weapons and supplies. The German retreat from Moscow reshaped the global perception of the war, proving that the fascist juggernaut was not invincible. For German soldiers, the retreat left scars that would never heal. Survivors carried memories of frozen marches, of comrades collapsing in the snow, of villages abandoned in flames. The psychological impact was immense. The sense of inevitability, of always marching forward, was gone forever. They now understood that the war would not be won in months, or perhaps even years. It would be a struggle without end, a nightmare from which there was no waking. For the Soviets, the retreat was remembered as the first great victory, a triumph of willpower, endurance, and resilience against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. It was proof that the sacrifices of the summer and autumn had not been in vain. The German retreat from Moscow was not merely a military maneuver, it was a reckoning. It revealed the flaws in German strategy, the limits of blitzkrieg, the dangers of underestimating an enemy, and the brutal realities of fighting in Russia. It reshaped the course of the war, turning a campaign of conquest into a war of attrition. And it gave hope to the Soviets, to the Allies, and to all who resisted Hitler that victory, though distant, was possible. The roads west of Moscow remained littered with the wreckage of the retreat for months. Abandoned tanks, frozen corpses, burned-out villages all bore silent testimony to the failure of Operation Typhoon. In those frozen fields, the Wehrmacht lost not just men and machines, but something far more vital, the myth of invincibility. And in their place, the Red Army found something equally priceless: belief in its own strength, the conviction that it could not only defend but also strike back. The German retreat was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a turning point that would echo across the years of war yet to come. The Battle of Moscow was more than a clash of armies. It was a confrontation of ideologies, wills, and illusions. When the smoke cleared and the frozen corpses lay strewn across snow-drifted fields, what lingered was not simply the record of casualties and kilometers gained or lost, but a profound shift in the very psychology of the war. For the first time since the Blitzkrieg campaigns had begun in 1939, the Wehrmacht had been stopped, repelled, and forced into retreat. For the first time, Hitler's grand design faltered against an enemy who refused to collapse, who refused to accept inevitability. The failure at Moscow reverberated through the German command, the Soviet state, and across the entire globe, reshaping the trajectory of the Second World War. For Hitler and his generals, the winter disaster forced a reckoning. The German High Command had built its campaigns on the premise that war could be swift, decisive, and executed with the precision of a machine. Poland had fallen in weeks. France had been humiliated in just 6. The Balkans, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, all collapsed under the hammer of speed, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. Moscow was to have been the crowning jewel of this strategy, the proof that Germany's destiny was unstoppable. Instead, it became the grave of that illusion. The Wehrmacht had advanced further and faster than any European army in history, but that success concealed the rot beneath the surface. Overstretched supply lines, fragile logistics, insufficient winter preparation, and a hubris that had underestimated the resilience of the Soviet Union. The generals understood these realities. They had warned of the risks, the distances, the challenges of Russian geography and climate. Yet they also bore responsibility, for many had shared the belief in a rapid collapse of the Soviet state. They had assumed the Red Army would break after Smolensk, after Kiev, after Vyazma. Each time, the enemy reformed, regrouped, and returned to the fight. The psychological shock of an adversary that absorbed losses of millions yet still fought with ferocity was immense. German soldiers wrote home in disbelief. They do not surrender, they fight and fight again. Where do they find such men? The answer was not just in numbers, but in the resolve of a people defending their homeland, led by a regime willing to sacrifice anything to survive. The retreat from Moscow also exposed the dangerous fissure between Hitler and his military commanders. Hitler's orders to hold ground at all costs, to advance even when advance was impossible, revealed his growing obsession with willpower over reality. For him, Moscow was not just a city, but a symbol of ideological victory, the destruction of Bolshevism's heart. For his generals, Moscow was a logistical nightmare, a gamble taken beyond reason. When retreat became unavoidable, Hitler raged, blaming cowardice, incompetence, or fate, anything but his own miscalculations. This blame seeped downward, poisoning the atmosphere of command. Trust eroded. Initiative dwindled. Officers who had once acted with boldness now hesitated, fearful of contradicting their Führer. Strategically, the failure marked the moment when Hitler began to tighten his grip on operational decisions, overriding professionals with his own inflexible directives. For the soldiers themselves, the retreat was a psychological earthquake. Until then, the Wehrmacht had marched from triumph to triumph. They had believed in their own superiority, in the myth of invincibility that Nazi propaganda endlessly trumpeted. Moscow shattered that myth. Men who had expected to celebrate Christmas in the Kremlin instead found themselves freezing in snow-covered fields, abandoning equipment, retreating under pressure. The shock was not merely physical, though frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion claimed thousands. It was existential. If Moscow could withstand them, if the Soviets could not only defend but counterattack, then what other illusions of easy victory would collapse in time? Doubt seeped into the ranks, a slow poison that no speech or medal could fully dispel. On the Soviet side, the psychological transformation was no less dramatic, but it pointed in the opposite direction. In June, the Red Army had been in ruins. Millions had been captured, divisions annihilated, entire armies encircled. The German advance had seemed unstoppable, and the specter of national collapse loomed. Yet, by December, Moscow still stood. The Soviet people, once paralyzed by shock, now exhaled with renewed confidence. Stalin, who only months earlier had been criticized for hesitancy and miscalculation, emerged as the man who had held the capital, who had mobilized reinforcements from Siberia, who had chosen Zhukov to orchestrate the counteroffensive. His legitimacy, once fragile, solidified in the fires of crisis. From then on, Stalin's word would carry the weight of infallibility. Moscow had saved not just the Soviet state, but also the Soviet leader's authority. For Soviet soldiers, the victory was a revelation. They had learned, painfully and at great cost, how to fight the Wehrmacht. They had discovered the value of defense in depth, of strategic withdrawals, of exploiting the vastness of their land to stretch German logistics to breaking point. They had seen that even the mightiest enemy could bleed, falter, and fail. The arrival of Siberian divisions hardened, well-trained, clothed in fur, their morale unbroken, was a reminder that the Soviet Union was far from exhausted. With fresh troops, with the capital secured, and with the German retreat in full view, the Red Army's confidence soared. Soldiers who once doubted the future now believed not just in survival but in eventual victory. The psychological effect on the Soviet population was equally immense. In the dark days of autumn, when German panzers thundered toward the capital and evacuation seemed imminent, fear and despair had threatened to paralyze the city. But when Stalin chose to remain in Moscow, when he rallied the people with speeches of defiance, when civilians dug trenches and built barricades with their bare hands, a new spirit was born. The victory validated their suffering, their sacrifices, and their belief in the cause. Moscow became not just a city, but a symbol of resilience, proof that the Soviet people could endure anything, even the most terrifying onslaught in modern history. The psychological momentum shifted from despair to determination, from retreat to counterattack. Internationally, the implications were profound. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered not just for those on the battlefield, but for the watching world. In London, Churchill hailed Moscow as a turning point, proof that Hitler could be stopped. In Washington, Roosevelt saw in the Soviet defense a reason to deepen aid through Lend-Lease, to commit the resources necessary to sustain the Eastern Front. For neutral nations, the battle signaled that Germany's victory was not inevitable, that aligning with Hitler was no longer a guarantee of future power. For occupied peoples across Europe, from France to Yugoslavia, the defense of Moscow was a beacon of hope, a sign that liberation, though distant, was possible. The strategic consequences rippled through German planning. No longer could they assume that a single campaign would topple the Soviet Union. No longer could they ignore the vastness of the land, the resilience of the people, or the ferocity of winter. Blitzkrieg had met its limits. The war in the East would now be one of attrition, of resources, of endurance. Germany would have to fight not just against armies, but against geography, climate, and a foe with seemingly bottomless reserves of manpower. The psychological edge, once firmly in German hands, now belonged to the Soviets. From this point forward, every German advance would be haunted by the memory of Moscow, by the knowledge that victory was not inevitable, that retreat was always possible. For the Soviets, the lessons were clear and galvanizing. Preparation, timing, and coordination had been decisive. The counteroffensive launched in December was not merely a reaction, but a carefully planned stroke, unleashed at the precise moment when German forces were most vulnerable. The value of reserves, of intelligence, of environmental mastery, all were proven in blood. Partisan warfare, once scattered and improvised, had shown its effectiveness in disrupting German supply lines, complementing conventional operations. Civilian mobilization, from digging fortifications to manufacturing weapons, had demonstrated the power of a society unified in defense. These lessons would guide Soviet planning in the years ahead, as the Red Army transformed from a battered, desperate force into a juggernaut of counteroffensives. The Battle of Moscow was, in essence, a battle of illusions. For the Germans, it shattered the illusion of invincibility, of swift victory, of a weak and collapsing Soviet Union. For the Soviets, it shattered the illusion of helplessness, of inevitable defeat, of being perpetually on the defensive. It revealed the true nature of the war, a titanic struggle where endurance, adaptation, and resilience mattered as much as tanks and planes. Psychologically, it marked the moment when the tide began to turn, not yet in territory or numbers, but in belief, in morale, in the conviction that Hitler could be beaten. From that winter onward, every German soldier who marched eastward carried with him the memory of Moscow, the cold, the retreat, the first taste of failure. And every Soviet soldier who fought carried the memory of survival, of resistance, of the moment when the enemy had been driven back. The battle's psychological weight was immense, shaping perceptions, decisions, and morale for years to come. Strategically, it forced a recalibration of plans. shifting Germany toward defensive thinking and emboldening the Soviets to prepare for the long war ahead. The fields around Moscow became more than a battlefield. They became a symbol, etched into the minds of millions, that even the strongest armies could falter and that resilience could triumph over brute force. The snow-covered forests, the frozen rivers, the wrecked tanks, these were not just relics of combat, but reminders of a turning point in human history. The Battle of Moscow had been a clash of steel and blood, but its true impact lay in the minds it changed, the illusions it destroyed, and the resolve it created. The Battle of Moscow was more than a contest of arms. It was a crucible that tested every assumption, every doctrine, and every weakness of both sides. In the aftermath, as the frozen bodies were buried and the shattered tanks rusted beneath blankets of snow, commanders and politicians alike sought to understand what had transpired. For the Germans, it was the first great reckoning, the realization that their formula for victory was flawed. For the Soviets, it was the discovery that resilience, preparation, and adaptation could overturn even the mightiest assault. The lessons drawn from Moscow would shape the entire course of the war that followed, altering strategies, doctrines, and the psychological compass of millions. For the Wehrmacht, the most immediate lesson was the danger of overextension. Operation Typhoon had promised rapid encirclement and decisive seizure of the Soviet capital. On maps, it had looked brilliant, precise arrows sweeping forward to close traps and deliver a death blow. But maps did not bleed, nor did they freeze. In reality, those arrows represented men trudging through mud and snow, trucks grinding to a halt for lack of fuel, horses collapsing from exhaustion, and commanders forced to decide whether to abandon artillery or starve their troops. The German army had advanced too far, too fast, and without the infrastructure to sustain itself. Supply lines stretched over vast distances, became fragile cords, easily severed by partisans or the weather itself. Without fuel, panzers became steel coffins. Without food, soldiers became gaunt shadows, unable to fight or march. Without reserves, every loss was irreplaceable. Overextension was not merely a logistical inconvenience, it was the Achilles heel of an army built on speed. The failure at Moscow also revealed the limits of blitzkrieg itself. The doctrine that Tilly had brought triumph in Poland, and France relied on speed, coordination, and the collapse of the enemy's will. Against the Soviets, these elements still mattered, but they were no longer decisive on their own. The Red Army absorbed the shocks, reformed, and returned to fight. Soviet territory was so vast that even the deepest breakthroughs became swallowed in endless space. The climate itself slowed mechanized warfare to a crawl. Blitzkrieg was a weapon designed for temperate Europe, for short campaigns against smaller states. In the immensity of Russia, amid frozen rivers and snow-choked forests, it lost its edge. The Germans learned, too late, that doctrine could not be transplanted without adaptation. They had mastered the art of rapid conquest, but not the art of sustained war. Winter exposed other failures as well. The German soldier, disciplined and skilled, was nevertheless ill-prepared for the Russian climate. The High Command had assumed victory before winter, and so they had not provided adequate clothing, shelter, or equipment. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets in some units. Lubricants froze in rifle chambers. Engines refused to start in sub-zero temperatures. The Wehrmacht, a modern military machine, was reduced to scavenging sheepskins and burning fuel stocks just to survive the night. The lesson was clear and brutal. No army, however advanced, could ignore the environment. To fight in Russia meant preparing for Russia, for her winters, her mud, her vast and merciless spaces. The arrogance that had dismissed these factors was now paid for in blood and defeat. Perhaps the most painful lesson for the Germans was the danger of rigid command. Hitler's insistence on capturing Moscow blinded him to the realities his generals saw in the field. His refusal to allow retreats turned minor setbacks into disasters. His obsession with symbolic goals outweighed practical necessities. The generals, for their part, failed to unite in opposition. Some shared his illusions, others lacked the courage to confront him. The result was an army commanded by fear rather than reason, bound to a course of action dictated not by strategy but by ideology. The Wehrmacht learned, bitterly, that a war directed from Berlin's chancellery would be vulnerable to the whims of one man. What Moscow had revealed was not just operational overreach, but a structural flaw, a system where military necessity was subordinated to political fantasy. From the Soviet perspective, the lessons were opposite but no less profound. The first was the value of strategic depth. In the opening months of Barbarossa, Soviet forces had been annihilated in border battles. Armies had been surrounded and destroyed. Yet, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Its vastness allowed time and space to regroup, to move industries eastward, to summon reserves from Siberia and Central Asia. Moscow confirmed that this depth was not merely geographic but strategic. By trading space for time, the Soviets had drawn the Germans into exhaustion, into overextension. The defense of Moscow showed that survival was not dependent on holding every kilometer but on preserving the core strength of the nation until the moment was ripe for counterattack. Strategic depth became a weapon as potent as any tank or cannon. Another lesson lay in operational flexibility. The Red Army of 1941 had been battered, reeling, often clumsy in execution. But it learned with terrifying speed. By December, it was no longer the same force that had collapsed in June. Commanders adapted, learning to coordinate arms, to conduct elastic defenses, to use the terrain to their advantage. The counteroffensive at Moscow revealed a new level of operational maturity, striking at overextended flanks, exploiting intelligence, and timing attacks to coincide with German weakness. Soviet planners recognized that victory would not come from brute force alone, but from the careful orchestration of timing, reserves, and deception. Feigned retreats, dummy positions, partisan raids, all were integrated into a strategy of resilience. The lesson was that survival could become victory if one knew when to strike. For the Red Army, the counteroffensive also validated the importance of combined arms. Infantry alone could not withstand German panzers, but infantry supported by artillery, tanks, and air power could blunt and even reverse assaults. At Moscow, these elements were brought together in a more coordinated way than at any point earlier in the campaign. Artillery softened German positions, tanks exploited breakthroughs, infantry held the ground, cavalry and ski troops harassed flanks, partisans struck behind the lines. The synergy of these efforts created a web of pressure that the Wehrmacht could not fully resist. From Moscow onward, the Red Army sought to refine this coordination, transforming itself into a machine capable of large-scale offensives. The lesson was unmistakable. No single arm could win the war. Victory required the integration of all. Timing, too, emerged as a decisive principle. The Soviets had chosen the moment of counteroffensive with precision, when German supply lines were stretched, when frost had immobilized vehicles, when morale had sunk, when reserves from Siberia could be unleashed. This sense of timing turned German exhaustion into opportunity. It proved that even an army recovering from disaster could seize initiative if it struck at the right moment. The lesson was etched into Soviet doctrine. Do not waste strength on futile attacks. Wait until the enemy is weakest, then strike with everything at once. Partisan warfare provided another revelation. Small groups operating behind German lines disrupted supply chains, blew up railroads, ambushed convoys. On their own, these acts were pinpricks, but multiplied across thousands of kilometers, they became a hemorrhage. The Germans were forced to divert manpower to secure rear areas, weakening their front. The Soviets realized that partisan warfare was not merely a sideshow, but an integral component of strategy. By coordinating partisans with regular operations, they created a two-front battle, one at the front lines, another in the enemy's rear. This lesson transformed Soviet planning, embedding irregular warfare into their broader doctrine. a recognition that resistance could come from every village, every forest, every farmer with a rifle. The human lessons were no less critical. For the Germans, Moscow revealed the limits of morale when expectations collapsed. Soldiers who had marched with confidence through Europe now faced despair when their invincibility was broken. Letters from home, once sources of comfort, became reminders of distance and doubt. Commanders struggled to sustain discipline as frostbite, hunger, and retreat eroded spirit. The Wehrmacht learned that morale was not infinite, that even the best-trained soldier could crumble when faith in victory dissolved. For the Soviets, the opposite was true. Moscow proved that morale could be reborn from survival, that victories, however small at first, could grow into a tide of confidence. Soldiers fought not only for orders but for revenge, for their homes, for the survival of their families. Civilians, who had dug trenches and built barricades, saw their work vindicated. The psychological lesson was that resilience could be as decisive as weaponry, that willpower could transform despair into determination. The political lessons were equally profound. For Hitler, Moscow undermined his credibility with his generals, but his reaction was not to yield power but to tighten it. He blamed others, centralized control, and placed even more weight on his own judgment. The lesson he drew was the opposite of what reality demanded. He concluded not that flexibility was necessary, but that greater will and greater obedience would deliver future victory. This delusion would haunt German strategy until the end. For Stalin, Moscow cemented his authority. His decision to stay in the city, his speeches of defiance, his gamble to deploy Siberian reserves, all paid off. The victory became his personal triumph, reinforcing the image of Stalin as the unshakable leader of a nation under siege. The lesson for him was that centralized planning, ruthless mobilization, and political control could ensure survival. From this point onward, Stalin's grip on the Soviet Union would be unassailable, his authority strengthened by the perception that he had saved Moscow. The broader lesson for both sides was that modern warfare was not simply a matter of battles, but of systems, logistics, morale, politics, environment, and industry all intertwined. The Germans had believed that tactical brilliance alone could deliver victory. Moscow taught them that brilliance was nothing without supply, preparation, and adaptability. The Soviets had suffered catastrophic losses, but had survived through organization, endurance, and depth. Moscow taught them that survival was the prelude to victory, that resilience itself was a weapon. Historians would later call Moscow the first great turning point of the war, not because it destroyed the Wehrmacht, but because it destroyed illusions. The Germans learned that the Soviet Union would not collapse, that the war in the East would be long and brutal. The Soviets learned that the Wehrmacht could be beaten, that preparation and timing could overcome even the fiercest onslaught. Both sides carried these lessons forward, and they would shape every campaign that followed. Stalingrad, Kursk, the drive to Berlin. The Battle of Moscow, in its ice and blood, became a teacher more powerful than any general. Its lessons were written in frostbite and starvation, in ruined tanks and abandoned trenches, in speeches shouted over loudspeakers to soldiers and civilians alike. It taught humility to those who thought themselves invincible, and courage to those who thought themselves doomed. In its aftermath, the war entered a new phase, one defined not by easy victories but by grinding endurance, where lessons learned in one winter would echo across years of conflict. The Battle of Moscow did not end with a grand parade or the unconditional surrender of an enemy army. It ended in exhaustion, in frost-bitten silence, in columns of retreating men dragging their wounded comrades through snow. And yet, in that moment of attrition and survival, history shifted. What had begun as Hitler's bold attempt to decapitate the Soviet Union ended as his first great defeat. What had seemed to be an unstoppable tide of conquest broke upon the defenses of a single city. The legacy of that battle would echo across every subsequent chapter of the war, shaping not only military doctrine but also morale, politics, and the global perception of the conflict. It was a moment in which myths died and new realities were born. For the Germans, Moscow's legacy was humiliation cloaked in denial. In the propaganda reels shown back in Berlin, the campaign was portrayed as a necessary pause, a strategic withdrawal in the face of winter. The truth was far harsher. The Wehrmacht had failed to take its objective, had been driven back by an enemy it had been assured was inferior, and had left behind tens of thousands of dead, hundreds of destroyed tanks, and a myth of invincibility shattered in the snow. The psychological consequences of this failure reverberated through every German soldier and commander. For the first time since 1939, defeat was not theoretical but lived. Letters from the front carried not just stories of heroism but confessions of doubt, of despair, of frost-bitten feet, and comrades lost to the cold. The impact upon Hitler was profound and paradoxical. Rather than moderating his ambitions, the failure in Moscow hardened them. He came to believe that defeat had come not from flawed strategy, but from weakness in will, that had his generals and soldiers pushed harder, endured more, shown greater resolve, Moscow would have fallen. The lesson he drew was not that flexibility was required, but that obedience must be absolute. It marked the beginning of a pattern in which Hitler tightened his control, forbidding retreats, demanding impossibilities, and punishing those who failed to deliver victories. The legacy for Germany was thus a poisonous one. The institutionalization of inflexibility, the elevation of ideology over pragmatism, and the entrenchment of a delusion that the war could still be won through sheer determination alone. Yet for the rank and file, Moscow remained a wound. Veterans who had marched triumphantly through Paris or Warsaw now carried the memory of starving in frozen forests outside the Soviet capital, the scars of frostbite, the recollections of endless retreats under Soviet artillery fire, the sight of abandoned tanks turned into frozen monuments. These memories undermined the confidence that had once been their greatest weapon. The aura of the Wehrmacht as an unstoppable force, whispered in dread across Europe, was irreparably cracked. Moscow proved that the German army could be halted, could be thrown back, and that it was not immune to the same mistakes and vulnerabilities that had doomed other armies before it. For the Soviets, the legacy was the opposite, a moment of rebirth. The survival of Moscow was not merely a military victory, it was a moral one. Stalin had stayed in the city when others urged evacuation. Citizens had dug trenches and fortified defenses. Soldiers had held the line under impossible conditions. The victory became a symbol of Soviet resilience, proof that the nation could withstand the storm. Moscow's defense was celebrated not only in speeches and propaganda posters, but in the renewed determination of millions who had doubted their ability to resist. If the capital could endure, so could Leningrad, Stalingrad, and the countless villages that dotted the endless steppe. The victory also reinforced Stalin's authority. His decision to deploy Siberian reserves, to gamble on a counteroffensive in the depths of winter, became points of propaganda that elevated him as the indispensable leader. In truth, many of these choices were products of collective planning, of Zhukov's brilliance, and the sacrifices of ordinary soldiers. But in the narrative that emerged, Stalin was the figure who had stood firm when others would have faltered. The political legacy of Moscow thus entrenched his power, ensuring that for the remainder of the war and long after, his rule would be unchallenged. The city became his symbol, a monument not only to Soviet resistance, but to the legitimacy of his leadership. Internationally, the significance of Moscow's defense cannot be overstated. For months, Allied capitals had watched the German advance with despair. The fall of France, the collapse of the Balkans, and the rapid destruction of Soviet armies in the summer of 1941 had created a grim picture. Many in London and Washington doubted whether the Soviet Union could last the winter. Yet Moscow stood. News that the Red Army had not only held the capital but had driven the Germans back electrified Allied morale. Churchill spoke of it as a turning point. Roosevelt saw in it the proof that the Soviet Union was a partner worth supporting, and ordinary citizens across the world celebrated the blow struck against Hitler's empire. The victory reassured the world that the Axis was not invincible, that resistance was not futile. It marked the beginning of a broader confidence that the tide of war could, in time, be turned. From a strategic perspective, Moscow reshaped the Eastern Front. Before the battle, Hitler had envisioned a swift conquest of the Soviet Union, the seizure of its capital, and the destruction of its political and military heart. After the battle, such ambitions were no longer credible. The war in the East was revealed to be not a campaign but a struggle of years, one that would demand resources, manpower, and endurance on a scale the Reich had not anticipated. Moscow had forced Germany into a war of attrition for which it was ill-prepared. It exposed systemic weaknesses, the limits of blitzkrieg, the fragility of logistics, the over-reliance on speed, and the inability to adapt to hostile climates. These lessons, ignored by Hitler, nevertheless shaped the course of German strategy, forcing a shift from rapid conquest to defensive consolidation. For the Soviets, the battle became the foundation for future doctrine. The lessons of combined arms, of timing offensives, of exploiting environmental conditions, were integrated into operational planning. The integration of partisan warfare into broader strategy was recognized as a powerful tool, and the mobilization of civilians into defensive and logistical roles became standard practice. The Red Army, once derided as clumsy and outdated, had proven it could adapt, learn, and strike effectively. Moscow gave it not just experience but confidence, the knowledge that it could confront the Wehrmacht on equal terms. The human legacy was perhaps the most enduring. For German soldiers, the retreat from Moscow left behind a generation haunted by visions of endless snow, frozen comrades, and the sound of Soviet artillery echoing through the forests. For Soviet soldiers and civilians, it left behind memories of unity, of defiance, of survival against all odds. These memories were woven into the fabric of identity, becoming myths and stories told long after the war. Moscow became a symbol, for the Germans, of hubris punished, for the Soviets, of resilience rewarded. The broader historical significance lay in timing. Moscow came in late 1941, before Pearl Harbor had drawn the United States fully into the war, before Stalingrad and Kursk, before the Allies landed in North Africa or Normandy. It was the first major defeat of the German war machine, the first crack in the illusion of invincibility. It proved that Hitler could be resisted, that his armies were not unstoppable, that the war was not predetermined. In that sense, Moscow was more than a battle. It was a message. To the Allies it said, "Stand firm, victory is possible." To the Germans it said, "Beware, your reach has limits." To the Soviets it said, "Endure, for endurance brings triumph." The legacy of Moscow also lay in its demonstration of the interdependence of factors often overlooked in war. Environment, logistics, morale, and politics were revealed to be as decisive as tanks and guns. No commander could afford to ignore the weather. No army could advance without supply. No nation could triumph without the will of its people. Moscow encapsulated this truth in brutal clarity. It showed that modern war was total, that it demanded the coordination of every element of society, from the soldier at the front, to the worker in the factory, to the child digging trenches on the city's outskirts. In the years that followed, the echoes of Moscow were heard everywhere. At Stalingrad, where Soviet resilience was again tested and vindicated. At Kursk, where German tanks found themselves blunted by Soviet preparation. At Berlin, where the Red Army, hardened by years of lessons, would finally exact its revenge. Moscow was the beginning of that arc, the first time the tide turned, the moment when hope returned to those who had feared the world might fall to tyranny. The city itself bore the scars of its near death. Trenches dug around its suburbs, barricades raised in its streets, factories converted to war production. These became silent witnesses to a time when survival had hung by a thread. But Moscow endured, and in enduring, it became immortalized. In Soviet memory, It was celebrated in parades and monuments, in songs and films, as the place where the tide of history had shifted. In German memory, it was whispered as a warning, a reminder of what happens when ambition blinds reason. The ultimate significance of Moscow lies in its role as a lesson in humility. For the Germans, it taught that no empire is invincible, that arrogance is the enemy of victory. For the Soviets, it taught that even in the darkest hour, resilience can prevail. For the world, it marked the moment when the war ceased to be a series of German triumphs and became instead a struggle whose outcome was uncertain. It was the first fracture in Hitler's empire, a fracture that would widen until it broke. Thus, the Battle of Moscow stands not merely as a chapter in military history but as a turning point in the story of humanity's confrontation with tyranny. It was a battle of frost and fire, of desperation and determination, of hubris and humility. Its legacy endures because it speaks not only of tanks and trenches, but of the human spirit, the will to resist, to endure, to adapt, and to triumph, even when the odds seem insurmountable. In the frozen fields outside Moscow, history learned that victory is not always won by those who strike first or hardest, but by those who endure longest. And from that endurance was born the eventual collapse of the Reich and the liberation of a world. The myth of German invincibility had been carefully constructed over years of conquest, victories that seemed to flow effortlessly from one campaign to another. From the lightning thrust through Poland, to the astonishing collapse of France in mere weeks, to the rapid encirclements in the Balkans and the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht had cultivated an aura of unstoppable power. Soldiers marched with a sense of inevitability. Officers, hardened by early triumphs, believed that their tactical doctrines of blitzkrieg would forever sweep aside opposition. Propaganda amplified this sense of invulnerability, assuring both the German public and occupied populations that the Reich's armies were a modern force unmatched in history. Yet, on the snowbound fields outside Moscow, in the log, the winter of 1941, that carefully nurtured illusion began to collapse under the crushing weight of reality. The retreat from the gates of Moscow was more than a military maneuver. It was a shattering of confidence at every level of the German war machine. Soldiers who had once believed themselves destined for quick victory were now stumbling backward, frostbitten, exhausted, and hunted by an enemy they had been told was already broken. The psychological blow was profound. For months, the men of the Wehrmacht had advanced eastward with the rhythm of inevitability, certain that each river crossing, each captured city, each Soviet retreat meant they were on the verge of final triumph. But the Soviet counteroffensive, unleashed with shocking force in December, reversed that narrative. Suddenly, it was the Germans who were reeling. The Germans who were forced to abandon positions, to leave behind tanks frozen in place, and to witness the Red Army pressing forward with renewed energy. For the common soldier, the impact of Moscow's defense was immediate and visceral. The long marches in deep snow, the hunger gnawing at their stomachs, the frost that blackened their fingers and toes. All these physical hardships collided with the emotional realization that the enemy was not only unbroken, but stronger than before. The Soviets had not collapsed. They had endured, adapted, and counterattacked. German letters sent home from the Eastern Front in December 1941 told of despair, of men losing faith in the war's direction, of comrades freezing to death in their foxholes. Morale, which had soared across Europe during the triumphant campaigns of 1939 and 1940, sagged under the weight of fatigue and disillusion. This collapse in morale was not limited to the rank and file. Within the officer corps, doubts began to gnaw at the belief that German strategy was flawless. The logistical nightmare of Operation Barbarossa had already revealed cracks in planning, but the failure at Moscow made those cracks chasms. Officers who had sworn by the doctrines of speed and encirclement now confronted the limits of such tactics in a land of endless distances, harsh winters, and a relentless opponent. Heated arguments broke out in staff meetings, as some generals sought to retreat and regroup while Hitler insisted on holding ground at all costs. This divergence between field reality and political will deepened the crisis of confidence. Propaganda at home struggled to mask the reality of what was happening. Goebbels and the Nazi media machine continued to insist that Moscow was within reach, that the Soviet Union was collapsing under its own weight. But even within Germany, whispers began to spread of terrible conditions, of retreats, of losses that could not be explained away as tactical withdrawals. Families received letters that told of frostbite, of starvation, of sons lost in the snow. The veil of invincibility was lifting, replaced by a growing awareness that the Eastern Front was not another quick campaign but a brutal war of attrition. For Hitler himself, the failure to take Moscow struck at the core of his own myth-making. He had promised victory before the snows of winter, and his confidence had fueled the entire campaign. Now, faced with the undeniable fact of retreat, he lashed out at his generals, accusing them of cowardice or incompetence. Yet, behind the rage lay an uncomfortable truth. The limits of his vision had been exposed. The Eastern Front would not yield to rapid conquest. The Soviet Union was not another Poland or France. It was a vast colossus, capable of enduring catastrophic losses and still mustering overwhelming force. The blow to Hitler's prestige among his generals was quiet but real. They obeyed his commands, but whispers of doubt began to echo through the ranks of the high command, doubts that would only grow louder as the war dragged on. Among the Axis allies, the retreat from Moscow reverberated as well. Italy, Hungary, and NS. Romania had committed forces to the Eastern Front under the belief that they were joining an unstoppable juggernaut. Instead, they now faced the grim prospect of fighting in an endless war against an enemy who refused to die. Confidence in German leadership weakened, even as Axis armies continued to fight under German direction. The sense that Berlin's promises of swift victory were hollow spread quietly but inexorably among Allied commanders. Internationally, Moscow's survival and Germany's retreat altered the global perception of the war. In London and Washington, news of the Soviet counteroffensive was met with relief and renewed determination. The Wehrmacht could be stopped. The myth of German invincibility that had haunted Allied planners since 1939 was finally broken. It was not yet the end of Germany's triumphs, but it was a signal that the tide could, and eventually would, turn. On the ground, the soldiers felt the myth crumbling in the most personal ways. They had believed themselves masters of Europe, men who carried the aura of certainty wherever they marched. But now, stripped of proper clothing, weakened by hunger, and forced into retreat, they felt human again, vulnerable, mortal, and afraid. The once proud panzers lay immobilized in snowbanks. Horses collapsed in the cold. Comrades froze to death in their sleep. The terrifying simplicity of blitzkrieg had given way to the chaotic grind of survival. The psychological shift was irreversible. The invincible Wehrmacht had been bloodied and turned back. Each soldier carried the memory of Moscow as a scar, a reminder that they were not unstoppable. That realization spread through the ranks like a quiet infection, undermining morale and making future victories less certain, less confident. Soldiers would fight on, out of discipline, fear, or loyalty. But the edge of certainty, the belief in inevitability, had been lost. For the Soviets, the crumbling of German invincibility was as important as their own counteroffensive. The sight of retreating German columns, the abandonment of equipment, the capture of prisoners who spoke of despair, all these were proof that the enemy could be beaten. The aura of invincibility that had once paralyzed Soviet commanders and soldiers alike had been dispelled. Moscow stood, the Red Army had held, and the German war machine had faltered. The psychological balance of the war had shifted. The collapse of invincibility is difficult to measure in numbers, but its effects ripple through every decision, every battle. From this point forward, German commanders would plan with a shadow of doubt. Soldiers would march with the memory of Moscow haunting their steps. And Hitler himself, though still commanding with arrogance, could never again promise certain and swift victory. In the end, the crumbling myth of invincibility was one of Moscow's greatest victories. The battlefield losses were immense, the suffering unimaginable, but the psychological transformation was decisive. The Wehrmacht was still powerful, still dangerous, still capable of terrible destruction, but it was no longer a force that seemed beyond defeat. The myth was broken, and in its place rose the reality of a long, grinding war that would eventually consume Germany's strength. The Battle of Moscow did not end the war, but it ended the illusion. The world now knew, and the Germans themselves began to realize, that they could be stopped. From that moment, every march forward was tinged with uncertainty, every operation haunted by the memory of failure. The invincible army was invincible no longer, and that knowledge reshaped the war to come. The survival of Moscow was not only the achievement of armies and commanders, it was the triumph of a people at war. The winter of 1941 revealed that the Soviet Union's greatest weapon was not just the Red Army's tanks, artillery, or Siberian divisions, but the endurance and determination of its people. In cities and villages, in factories and forests, on the front lines and behind them, ordinary men, women, and even children became combatants in a struggle that consumed every resource and demanded every sacrifice. The People's War, as it came to be called, transformed the defense of Moscow into more than a military campaign. It became a collective act of survival, where every trench dug, every rifle assembled, and every bridge sabotaged by partisans was a blow struck in defense of the motherland. The Soviet state had always demanded total loyalty, but never before had it mobilized so completely the human spirit of its citizens. When Hitler's armies approached the gates of Moscow, the city was transformed almost overnight into a fortress prepared by its inhabitants. Students, factory workers, women, and pensioners, those who could not hold rifles in the trenches, took up shovels, picks, and axes. They dug vast networks of anti-tank ditches that stretched for miles, constructed barricades from rubble and steel, and reinforced defenses with whatever materials were at hand. Entire neighborhoods organized themselves into shifts, working day and night under freezing conditions, their breath turning to mist as they carved defenses into the frozen earth. It was an extraordinary sight. A modern capital with its spires and avenues turned into a medieval citadel defended by the labor of its people. The industrial heart of the Soviet Union, too, became part of the battlefield. Factories in and around Moscow churned ceaselessly, producing rifles, ammunition, and artillery at a pace that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Women formed the majority of these workforces, their hands blistered and blackened by machinery, their faces lined with fatigue. Many worked 12, even 16 hours a day, often sleeping in the factories to save precious time. Young boys and girls joined them, carrying supplies, sweeping floors, and learning trades far beyond their years. The weapon that rolled off the assembly line was not simply a tool of war, it was a lifeline, a contribution to the city's survival. The pride of these workers was immense. They knew that their labor was as vital as the bullets fired at the front. Beyond Moscow, entire factories were dismantled and relocated eastward to the Urals and Siberia, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. This monumental logistical effort involved thousands of trains, each loaded with machines, equipment, and workers. Families were uprooted, homes abandoned, entire industrial complexes transported piece by piece into distant regions. Yet, instead of despair, there was grim determination. These sacrifices ensured that even as the Wehrmacht threatened the capital, the Soviet Union's war industry not only survived but grew. In new cities like Magnitogorsk and Chelyabinsk, the relocated factories roared to life, producing tanks, planes, and artillery in quantities that would later overwhelm German production. Moscow's defense was thus tied to a larger national mobilization that stretched across thousands of miles. The role of partisans in the People's War cannot be overstated. Behind German lines, bands of Soviet fighters, often peasants, escaped soldiers, and local officials waged a shadow war that disrupted the enemy at every turn. In forests and swamps, they ambushed convoys, derailed trains, and cut telegraph lines. Their knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage that no German officer could replicate. Even small actions, a bridge destroyed, a truck ambushed, had profound effects, slowing supply lines, forcing diversions, and creating a constant atmosphere of fear among German troops. For the partisans, the war was deeply personal. Many had seen their villages burned, their families executed or deported, their neighbors enslaved. Revenge fueled their resolve, and their attacks multiplied as the Germans pressed closer to Moscow. This irregular warfare became an extension of the decisive Red Army itself. Soviet commanders coordinated with partisan groups, integrating their intelligence into battle plans and using their disruptions to amplify counterattacks. German units never felt secure, even far behind the front. A convoy could vanish into smoke after hitting a mine, a garrison might find its supplies destroyed overnight, a train could be derailed by explosives hidden beneath the tracks. These actions weakened the Wehrmacht's aura of control and contributed directly to the slowing of their advance. In truth, the partisans represented the spirit of the Soviet people, resourceful, relentless, and unwilling to yield. The emotional heart of the People's War, however, lay in the city itself. Moscow's citizens endured air raids, shortages, and constant fear, yet their spirit held firm. At night, families huddled in cellars as bombs fell, emerging in the morning to continue work, repair damage, or dig fresh defenses. Rations were meager. Bread, potatoes, and watery soup formed the staple diet, but few complained. Hunger was endured as a weapon, another burden willingly shouldered for survival. Children carried sandbags to anti-aircraft positions, their small bodies straining under the weight, while mothers joined fire brigades to extinguish flames from incendiary bombs. In a city where the population had once bustled with life and commerce, daily survival became a collective act of defiance. The parade on Red Square in November 1941 symbolized the unity of the people and their army. Soldiers marched in formation across the cobblestones, past the Kremlin walls, as Stalin himself addressed the crowd. Many of those troops would march directly from the square to the front lines, where they fought and died within days. But the message was unmistakable. Moscow would not surrender. The presence of civilians watching from the sidelines, bundled in coats against the bitter cold, reinforced that the defense of the city was a shared endeavor. It was the moment that transcended military strategy, binding the fate of the capital to the will of its people. The psychological dimension of this people's war was profound. The knowledge that the entire nation was mobilized, from peasants in Siberia to children in Moscow, sustained the soldiers at the front. They fought not as individuals, but as part of a collective struggle in which every citizen played a role. Propaganda emphasized this unity, portraying the war as a sacred defense of the motherland, a struggle in which each sacrifice, no matter how small, was essential. The Red Army's resilience was thus intertwined with the morale of its civilians. Soldiers knew their families were working, suffering, and enduring for them, and this knowledge gave their sacrifices meaning. The brutality of German occupation further fueled this unity. Reports of massacres, forced labor, and the extermination of Jews and other targeted groups spread quickly through Soviet lines. Villages destroyed, civilians shot, entire communities erased. These atrocities hardened resolve. For many, the war became not just about defending Moscow, but about avenging unspeakable crimes. The German invader was no longer seen merely as an enemy army, but as a force of destruction that threatened the very existence of the Soviet people. This realization turned the defense of Moscow into a moral crusade, one that bound the entire population together in resistance. It is often said that wars are won not only by armies, but by societies. The Battle of Moscow exemplified this truth. Every Soviet citizen became a participant in the struggle, whether by building fortifications, producing weapons, joining partisan bands, or simply enduring deprivation with courage. The People's War transformed the defense of the capital into a national epic, one in which survival was not just measured by military lines but by the unyielding spirit of millions. When the Germans finally retreated, leaving behind their dead and their frozen machines. It was not only a military victory but a triumph of collective will. The Soviet people had stood together in the darkest of hours, proving that even against one of the most formidable armies in history, unity, sacrifice, and resilience could prevail. Moscow's survival was thus not just the survival of a city, but the affirmation of a nation's capacity to fight as one. The legacy of this people's war would endure long after the snow melted and the front lines shifted. It became a central part of Soviet identity, celebrated in songs, stories, and monuments. The ordinary citizens who dug trenches, worked in factories, or carried sandbags were remembered as heroes alongside the soldiers who fired the rifles. The message was clear. In the Soviet Union, victory was the work of all, and the people themselves were the foundation of triumph. In the end, the defense of Moscow was not simply about military maneuvers or grand strategy. It was about a people who refused to surrender, who turned their suffering into strength, and who made their capital into a fortress of resilience. The Battle of Moscow was the crucible in which the Soviet people proved that their war was not only fought by armies, but by everyone, everywhere, in every possible way. It was the ultimate demonstration that when a nation stands together, even the mightiest invader can be held at bay. The winter of 1941–42 did more than halt the German advance on Moscow. It forced both sides to stare into the mirror of their own strengths and weaknesses, to reconsider strategies, and to reshape their vision of what the war had become. The battle was not only fought with rifles, tanks, and artillery, it was also fought with lessons. Each decision taken, each error exposed by the snow and blood, carved itself into the minds of commanders, soldiers, and entire nations. From the wreckage of Operation Typhoon and the glory of Moscow's defense, two rival powers set about reassessing how they would fight a war that now promised to be far longer, bloodier, and more exhausting than either had initially believed. For Hitler and his generals, the failure before Moscow struck at the very heart of the Blitzkrieg doctrine. Lightning war had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe with unparalleled speed. It had crushed Poland in weeks, toppled France in a matter of months, and surged deep into Soviet territory during the summer of 1941. The essence of Blitzkrieg was momentum rapid thrusts by armored spearheads, supported by mobile infantry and air superiority, that overwhelmed the enemy before defenses could solidify. It was a doctrine built on audacity, shock, and above all, speed. Yet the Russian winter revealed its fragility. Momentum collapsed when engines froze, when fuel could not reach tanks, when soldiers lacked the clothing to march or the food to fight. Blitzkrieg, designed for campaigns of weeks, stumbled in a campaign that stretched into months. The myth of invincibility cracked under the weight of cold and resistance. In the immediate aftermath, the German High Command faced a grim reality. Operation Barbarossa had been designed to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign season. By December, that plan lay in ruins. Moscow had not fallen, the Red Army had not collapsed, and Hitler's dream of a quick victory was shattered. Now the Reich was locked in a war of attrition on a scale it had not prepared for. The lessons were harsh. Supply lines could not stretch endlessly across hostile terrain. Weather could cripple even the finest armies. The enemy's reserves, once dismissed, could materialize with devastating effect. And above all, ideological hubris. The belief that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with a few kicks had blinded German leaders to the resilience of their foe. Hitler, however, did not accept the lessons in the way his generals might have wished. To him, the failure was not one of strategy, but of will. He raged against his commanders, accusing them of weakness, hesitation, and cowardice. Retreat, in his eyes, was betrayal. He demanded that German forces hold every inch of ground, even when such stubbornness condemned entire divisions to destruction. He refused to accept that Moscow could not be taken, that the Soviet Union would not collapse in a single campaign. In his obsession, he clung to dreams while his armies bled in reality. Yet even as he ranted, his generals understood that something had changed. The war was no longer a sprint. It was a marathon that would test logistics, endurance, and the ability to wage total war. German planners began to study the implications with a sobering eye. They realized that supply chains needed radical improvement, that railways and roads had to be secured and rebuilt, that winter clothing and vehicles adapted for cold were no longer luxuries but necessities. The vastness of the Soviet Union demanded a new kind of planning, one that accounted not just for victories at the front, but for sustaining entire armies hundreds of miles from their bases. They saw the need for reserves, for defensive lines, for consolidation. Yet Hitler's refusal to yield ground often undermined these lessons, trapping his armies between reality and ideology. For the Soviets, the reassessment was of a different nature. Moscow's survival had vindicated their strategy, but it also revealed glaring weaknesses. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses in the opening months of the invasion. Millions of men had been killed or captured, thousands of tanks and planes destroyed. The early defeats had exposed the shortcomings of Soviet command structures, the consequences of Stalin's purges, and the inexperience of many officers. But the battle for Moscow showed that even after devastation, the Soviet Union could recover, adapt, and strike back. Stalin and his generals examined the lessons with cold clarity. The importance of reserves, of holding divisions in Siberia and the Far East until the right moment, had been proven decisive. The integration of partisans into broader strategy had amplified the effectiveness of counterattacks. The use of terrain and weather as weapons had demonstrated that battles could be shaped by factors beyond sheer firepower. Above all, they learned the value of patience, waiting until the Germans were overextended, exhausted, and vulnerable before launching their counteroffensive. Timing, they realized, could be as decisive as numbers. The Red Army also began to reassess its organization. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery had improved during the counteroffensive, but it was still uneven. Communications were often unreliable, logistics stretched, and inexperienced officers sometimes squandered opportunities. The lessons of Moscow reinforced the need for combined arms operations, for greater discipline, and for improved training. Soviet factories, relocated eastward, would now ramp up production not just to replace losses, but to build an army capable of offensive operations on a massive scale. The vision was no longer merely survival. It was victory. On the human level, both armies reassessed the limits of endurance. German soldiers had marched thousands of kilometers, fought in relentless battles, and then faced the Russian winter without adequate preparation. Their diaries spoke of frostbite, hunger, and despair. They had learned that willpower alone could not sustain them when supply lines failed, when boots fell apart, when comrades froze in their sleep. Soviet soldiers, on the other hand, had discovered a different lesson: that survival was possible even under the harshest conditions if morale, support, and unity held firm. They had endured hunger, cold, and death, but they had held Moscow. That triumph gave them a psychological weapon as powerful as any rifle, the knowledge that the Wehrmacht could be stopped. Globally, the reassessment spread. Beyond the two combatants, the Allies watched Moscow's defense with fascination and relief. Until then, many in Britain and the United States had feared that the Soviet Union would collapse. The Red Army's survival and counteroffensive proved otherwise. It showed that Hitler could be resisted, that his armies were not invincible. For Churchill, it was vindication. For Roosevelt, it was reassurance that the Soviets would not fall before American aid could arrive. The lessons of Moscow influenced Allied planning, encouraging them to expand support through the Lend-Lease program and to see the Eastern Front as the decisive theater of the war. The reassessment extended into propaganda as well. For the Soviets, Moscow became a symbol of resilience, broadcast to the world as proof of Soviet strength. Posters, newspapers, and radio celebrated the victory as a turning point, inspiring not only their own citizens but resistance movements across occupied Europe. For the Germans, the propaganda machine struggled. How to explain the failure to take Moscow? How to sustain morale after months of boasting that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse? Official statements spoke of strategic withdrawals, of regrouping for future offensives. But the soldiers at the front knew the truth. They had been beaten back, and no words could erase the sting. In the months that followed, the lessons of Moscow shaped every decision. The Germans planned for new offensives in 1942, hoping to strike in the south, where the climate was less severe, and the oil fields of the Caucasus promised vital resources. The Soviets prepared to rebuild their armies, to train new officers, and to integrate the lessons of combined arms operations into their doctrine. Both sides knew that the war was now a struggle of years, not months, and that survival depended on learning from the crucible of Moscow. Yet, perhaps the greatest lesson of all was psychological. The Germans learned that they could be stopped, that their power had limits. The Soviets learned that they could stand, that defeat was not inevitable, that resilience could turn the tide. The battlefield of Moscow became a classroom, its snow and blood writing lessons in endurance, strategy, and human will that would echo through the remainder of the war. The strategic reassessment that followed Moscow was not abstract. It was written in the frozen corpses along the highways, in the abandoned tanks buried in snow, in the smoke rising from destroyed villages, in the weary faces of soldiers who had given everything and more. It was a reminder that war is not only about plans drawn on maps, but about the capacity to adapt, to endure, and to learn. Both sides carried these lessons forward into the battles of 1942, 1943, and beyond. Moscow had taught them all. Victory was possible, defeat was survivable, and the war would not be decided in a single campaign. It would be decided by those who could endure longest, adapt fastest, and learn most from the agony of the present. The reassessment was not merely strategic, it was existential. The world after Moscow would never be the same. The winter of 1941–42 did more than halt the German drive on Moscow, it forced a reckoning. In the snow-covered forests and frozen rivers outside the Soviet capital, the entire framework of the war shifted. It was not only a battlefield defeat for Hitler, it was a turning point in perception, strategy, and psychology. For the first time since the Second World War had begun, the Wehrmacht, which had seemed invincible, had been stopped and pushed back. Both sides, German and Soviet, were compelled to confront their limitations and re-evaluate their strategies. But the consequences of Moscow extended far beyond the two armies locked in combat. It reshaped the expectations of the Allies, rattled the Axis, and transformed the global narrative of the war. For the Germans, the failure before Moscow struck at the core of their faith in Barbarossa's blitzkrieg. The doctrine of lightning war had carried them from victory to victory, smashing Poland, France, the Low Countries, and then driving across the vast steppes of the Soviet Union in an unprecedented surge. Blitzkrieg was built on speed, surprise, and mobility, on armored spearheads that cut through enemy lines, and on air power that paralyzed defenses. Yet in the frozen mud and snow of Russia, speed vanished, surprise dissolved, and mobility was reduced to a crawl. Engines froze, vehicles stalled, and supply convoys could not keep up. The doctrine that had seemed unstoppable revealed itself to be brittle, dependent on perfect conditions and short campaigns. Moscow was not only a failed operation, it was the exposure of a weakness that the Germans could never entirely repair. The German High Command learned this truth with bitter clarity. Operation Barbarossa had been predicated on a quick victory. Hitler and his generals had assumed that the Soviet Union was a hollow shell, ready to collapse once struck. They believed its armies would be destroyed in the frontier battles, its cities captured in a matter of weeks, its people cowed into submission. Instead, by December, they found themselves with millions of men stranded hundreds of kilometers from their bases, fighting in sub-zero temperatures, without proper clothing, and against a Soviet army that had refused to die. The shock of survival, of seeing Moscow still standing, of facing a counteroffensive that hurled them backward, forced German officers to recognize that the war in the East would not be a short campaign, but a grinding struggle of years. And yet, even as the generals absorbed the lesson, Hitler refused to accept it. In his eyes, the setback was not a failure of strategy, but of will. He raged against his officers, condemning retreats as cowardice, insisting that the front be held at all costs. His refusal to yield territory, even when logic demanded withdrawal, condemned divisions to indignation, destruction. This obstinacy, born of ideology and ego, distorted the reassessment that Germany so desperately needed. Some officers saw clearly. Supply lines had to be shortened, winter clothing and equipment had to be prioritized, railways had to be rebuilt, reserves had to be established. They understood that success would now depend not only on audacious thrusts, but on logistical discipline and the capacity to endure. But Hitler's commands clashed with their insights, ensuring that the lessons of Moscow, though obvious, were never fully applied. For the Soviet Union, the lessons were different and more hopeful. The Red Army had been battered, suffering catastrophic losses in the first months of Barbarossa. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed. Thousands of tanks and planes were lost. Millions of soldiers were dead or captured. Stalin's purges of the officer corps before the war had left the Red Army riddled with inexperience. Yet Moscow proved that even in the face of annihilation, the Soviet Union could adapt, recover, and strike back. The survival of the capital was not only a military victory, it was proof of resilience. The Soviet High Command recognized the critical factors that had made the defense possible. The use of reserves, particularly the divisions transferred from Siberia and the Far East, had been decisive. Their timely arrival had tipped the balance, just as German forces faltered. The integration of partisans into the wider strategy, harassing German supply lines, sabotaging railways, ambushing convoys, had multiplied the pressure on the invaders. The use of terrain and weather as weapons had slowed the enemy and drained their strength. Above all, the Soviets learned the value of timing. By waiting until the Germans were exhausted, overextended, and unprepared for winter, they had transformed weakness into strength. The Red Army also saw where it needed to improve. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, though better during the counteroffensive, was still inconsistent. Communications often broke down, leading to confusion and missed opportunities. Logistics, stretched across enormous distances, had nearly failed in the defense. The Moscow campaign made clear the necessity of combined arms operations, of improved training, and of building an army not only for defense, but for large-scale offensives of its own. Soviet factories, relocated east of the Urals, were already ramping up production of tanks, planes, and artillery. Now the goal was not simply to survive, but to prepare for a war of reconquest. Both armies, German and Soviet, reassessed the human dimension of war as well. German soldiers had experienced the limits of endurance. They had marched across vast distances, fought in relentless battles, and then been asked to survive in conditions for which they were utterly unprepared. Frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion consumed more men than Soviet bullets. The diaries of soldiers speak of comrades freezing to death, of horses collapsing in the snow, of despair settling over entire units. They learned that discipline and willpower could not replace food, clothing, or shelter. The Soviets, by contrast, learned that survival was possible if morale held. Their troops had endured equal hardships, but they had endured them with the knowledge that they were defending their capital, their homes, their families. The psychological weapon of survival, of stopping the Wehrmacht, when the world thought it unstoppable, was as powerful as any rifle. Beyond the battlefield, the consequences of Moscow reverberated across the world. For the Allies, it was a moment of enormous significance. Until then, many in Britain and the United States had doubted whether the Soviet Union could withstand the German onslaught. The scale of Soviet losses had been staggering, and it seemed plausible that Stalin's regime might collapse. But the defense of Moscow changed that perception overnight. The Red Army had not only survived, it had driven the Germans back. For Churchill, it was confirmation that Hitler could be resisted. For Roosevelt, it was reassurance that the Soviet Union would remain in the fight long enough for American aid to make a difference. The survival of Moscow also reshaped Allied strategy. It encouraged Britain and the United States to expand the Lend-Lease program, sending tanks, trucks, food, and raw materials to the Soviet Union. It reassured them that such aid would not be wasted on a collapsing ally. It demonstrated that the Eastern Front would be the decisive theater of the war, where the fate of Hitler's empire would ultimately be decided. Propaganda in the West celebrated the Soviet stand, portraying Moscow as a symbol of resilience and defiance. The image of the Red Army as an indomitable force spread across newspapers and radio broadcasts, inspiring hope among occupied peoples in Europe. For the Axis, the impact was sobering. Italy, already reeling from failures in North Africa and Greece, now saw the myth of German invincibility shattered. Japan, which had signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, observed that Moscow's defense demonstrated Soviet strength in a way that discouraged any thoughts of attacking Siberia. Within Germany's own allies, doubts grew. If Hitler's armies could not capture Moscow, could they really achieve global domination? Confidence faltered, even if public propaganda continued to trumpet eventual victory. The propaganda battle itself was fierce. In the Soviet Union, Moscow's survival was celebrated as a turning point. Proof of the people's strength, Stalin's leadership, and the Red Army's ability to rise from disaster. Posters showed German soldiers frozen in the snow, defeated by Soviet resilience. Newspapers proclaimed the counteroffensive as the beginning of the end for Hitler. The city itself became a symbol of unbreakable determination. For the Germans, however, propaganda had to disguise disaster. Official statements described strategic withdrawals and regrouping, but soldiers at the front knew the truth. They had been beaten, and no words could erase that fact. The global perception of the war shifted dramatically. In Washington and London, Moscow's survival proved that Hitler could be stopped. It emboldened Allied leaders to plan for long-term victory rather than mere survival. In occupied Europe, resistance movements gained strength, encouraged by the knowledge that the Germans were not invulnerable. For neutral countries, the balance of power no longer seemed so decisively in favor of the Axis. The failure at Moscow marked the beginning of a psychological shift that would only deepen as the war dragged on. The reassessment of Moscow's lessons extended into future campaigns. For the Germans, it meant planning new offensives in the south in 1942, aiming for the Caucasus oil fields instead of Moscow. They hoped that by seizing vital resources, they could still cripple the Soviet Union. For the Soviets, it meant preparing for counteroffensives of greater scale, reorganizing their armies, training new officers, and learning to wield combined arms with greater precision. Both sides entered 1942, knowing that the war was no longer a sprint, but a brutal test of endurance. Perhaps the most profound impact of Moscow was psychological. For the Germans, it was the first time they had to admit that they could be stopped. For the Soviets, it was the first time they believed with certainty that they could win. That reversal of belief, more than territory or casualties, reshaped the course of the war. The Battle of Moscow was not the end of the war, but it was the end of illusions. Illusions of invincibility, illusions of collapse, illusions of inevitability. In the snow outside the Soviet capital, reality replaced fantasy, and the war entered a new phase. The lesson was written not only in maps and communiques, but in human suffering. It was written in the frost-bitten hands of soldiers who clutched their rifles until their fingers turned black. It was written in the burned villages left behind by scorched earth retreats. It was written in the diaries of German officers who wondered how an army that had swept across Europe could falter in the snows of Russia. It was written in the relief of Soviet civilians who saw their city still standing when they had been told it would surely fall. In sum, the combined reassessment and global impact of Moscow forged a new understanding of the war. The Germans learned that even the finest armies could be undone by distance, weather, and resilience. The Soviets learned that with preparation, patience, and unity, they could not only defend but also counterattack. The Allies learned that Hitler was not unstoppable, and the world learned that the Soviet Union would not collapse. The reverberations of those lessons reached far beyond the battlefield, into strategy, diplomacy, propaganda, and morale. Moscow was not just a city defended, it was a symbol, a turning point, a global event that altered the very shape of the conflict. In the winter of 1941-42, amid snow and fire, the world's greatest war changed direction. And the lessons of that change, strategic, psychological, and global, would echo through every campaign that followed, from Stalingrad to Kursk, from Normandy to Berlin. The battle was over, but its impact had only begun.